The Arizona sun did not forgive. It hung in the sky like the eye of an angry god, unblinking, merciless, watching every fool who wandered into its domain with the patience of something that had outlasted empires. The desert floor shimmered with heat mirages, false promises of water that danced just beyond reach, always retreating, always mocking those desperate enough to chase them. Jake Coulter was not chasing mirages. He had stopped believing in promises 3 years ago, when the last one had bled out on Nevada sand with his brother's name attached to it. Now he simply walked one boot in front of the other, leading a horse that could barely manage the same. Whiskey the horse, not the drink, though Jake could have used both, limped alongside him with the resignation of an animal that understood death was coming, but saw no point in rushing toward it. The mare's front left leg had caught a prairie dog hole 2 days back, and the resulting sprain had turned their 3-day journey into something that might not have an ending at all. Jake's canteen had been empty since yesterday morning. His lips had cracked sometime in the night, and now every breath tasted like copper and dust. He was 28 years old, though the sun had carved lines into his face that belonged to a man of 40. The war had started that aging. Everything since had finished it. The heat waves rising from the rocks created phantom shapes in the distance. Sometimes they looked like men on horseback, sometimes like buildings, sometimes like nothing at all, except the universe's way of reminding travelers that reality itself could not be trusted out here. Jake ignored them all. He had learned during the war that the mind would show you whatever it thought might break you, and the only defense was to keep moving until your legs gave out or the truth revealed itself. His hand rested on the Colt Navy revolver at his hip, more out of habit than intention. The gun had been his father's, carried through the Mexican-American War, and handed down with words that Jake still heard in his dreams. A man can lose money, lose land, lose his life, but don't ever lose your honor. That's the only thing that truly belongs to you. Thomas Coulter had died believing those words. Jake was still trying to figure out if believing them was wisdom or just another kind of madness. The canyon appeared without warning, as things often did. In this landscape, one moment there was nothing but flat desolation, and the next the earth split open into a wound of red rock and deep shadows. The walls rose up on either side like the ruins of some ancient cathedral, blocking out enough of the sun to drop the temperature by what felt like 20 degrees. Jake stopped walking for the first time in hours, his body recognizing sanctuary even before his mind caught up. Whiskey made a sound that might have been relief, might have been a death rattle. Jake ran his hand along the mare's neck, feeling the heat radiating from her coat, the trembling in muscles pushed far beyond their limits. "Easy, girl, we'll rest here." His voice came out as a croak barely human. He had not spoken aloud in 2 days, and his throat had forgotten how to make words that did not hurt. The canyon floor was scattered with loose rocks and the skeletal remains of plants that had given up their fight against the drought long ago. But there was shade here, blessed shade, and Jake guided Whiskey toward a spot where the rock wall curved inward to create a natural shelter. The mare folded her legs beneath her with obvious relief, and Jake knelt beside her, checking the swollen joint that had been their undoing, not broken. That was something, but not good either. She would need at least 3 days of rest before she could carry weight again, and Jake did not have 3 days. He had maybe 3 hours before dehydration finished what the sun had started. He leaned back against the cool stone and closed his eyes, allowing himself one moment of weakness before he would have to make decisions. The darkness behind his eyelids was a relief after the relentless brightness of the desert, and in that darkness, memories rose up like ghosts he could never quite outrun. Sam's face appeared first, as it always did. His brother had been 2 years older, 3 inches taller, and possessed of an optimism that Jake had never understood and could never replicate. Where Jake saw obstacles, Sam saw opportunities. Where Jake calculated risks, Sam charged ahead on faith and good intentions. It should have gotten him killed 100 times before it actually did. "We're going to find it, little brother. I can feel it. Our luck's about to change." Sam's voice echoed in Jake's memory, still so clear after 2 years that it might have been spoken yesterday. They had been riding through Nevada pockets, finely heavy with the modest haul from a played-out claim near Virginia City. Not enough to make them rich, but enough to stake a real operation. Enough to stop being drifters and start being something that mattered. The men had appeared from behind a ridge, just as the sun was setting, 4 of them on horseback, their faces hidden by bandanas in the dying light. Jake had known immediately what was happening, had reached for his gun, with the reflexes that 4 years of war had drilled into his bones. But Sam had hesitated. Sam always hesitated when violence was on the table and always believed there might be another way. That hesitation had cost him everything. The leader of the bandits had been tall, dressed in black, that seemed too fine for a common road agent. He had dismounted with the casual grace of a man who owned the world and everyone in it, and when he pulled down his bandana, Jake had seen a face that belonged in a Boston drawing room. Not a Nevada robbery, handsome in a cold way, educated, the kind of man who could quote Shakespeare while cutting your throat. "Gentlemen, I believe you have something that belongs to me." His voice had been smooth, almost friendly, as if they were discussing the weather rather than armed robbery. Jake had kept his hand on his gun, calculating angles, distances, odds. 4 against 2. Bad odds, but he had survived worse during the war. Sam had tried to talk. That was Sam's way, always trying to find the peaceful solution, always believing that reasonable men could reach reasonable agreements. He had offered to split the gold to give them half in exchange for safe passage. The man in black had seemed to consider it, tilting his head like a curious bird. Then he had drawn his pistol and shot Sam through the chest. The sound of that gunshot still woke Jake in the night 2 years later. He could still see the surprise on Sam's face, the way his brother had looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt, as if he could not quite understand what had happened. Sam had always believed in the basic goodness of people, and even in his last moments, that belief had kept him from comprehending that someone would kill him for no reason other than convenience. Jake had gotten 2 of them. His gun had cleared leather before Sam hit the ground, and his first shot had taken the bandit on the left through the throat. The second shot had dropped another man from his horse with a wound that was probably fatal, but might have just been crippling. But then something had hit Jake from behind the butt of a rifle wielded by a fourth man he had not seen, and the world had gone dark. When he woke up, Sam was dead. The gold was gone. The man in black and his surviving Confederate had ridden off, leaving Jake for dead in the desert. He probably should have died. Would have died if not for the Mexican merchant who had found him 2 days later, delirious with thirst and fever, and nursed him back to something resembling life. The merchant had told Jake he was lucky. Jake had not felt lucky. He had felt like a man who had failed the only person in the world who mattered, and whose continued existence was less a blessing than a punishment. In the 2 years since Jake had learned the name of the man who killed his brother, Silas Crane. The Crow, they called him in the territories because he always appeared after the carnage was done, picking over the remains of other men's misfortunes. He ran a loose network of thieves and killers, always staying one step ahead of the law, always too smart to get caught. Jake had searched for him across 3 territories, following rumors and cold trails, but Crane was a ghost who left nothing behind but bodies and empty pockets. The search had brought Jake here to the edge of Apache territory, following a lead that had probably been false from the start. Another dead end. Another wasted month. And now he was going to try in this canyon, and Silas Crane would never know that somewhere out there, a man had spent his last years trying to find him. Jake opened his eyes. The shadow of the canyon wall had shifted while he sat lost in memory, and now a thin blade of sunlight was creeping toward his boots. He did not know how long he had been sitting there, an hour, maybe more. Too long. If he was going to find water before dark, he needed to move now. He forced himself to his feet, every muscle protesting the effort. His head swam with the first stages of serious dehydration, and he had to brace himself against the rock wall until the dizziness passed. When he could see straight again, he looked down at Whiskey, still lying in the shade with her eyes half closed. "Stay here, girl. I'll be back." The horse did not respond, but Jake had not expected her to. He was talking to himself as much as to her, filling the silence with sound, reminding himself that he was still alive, still capable of making choices that mattered. He walked deeper into the canyon, one hand trailing along the stone wall for balance. The floor sloped gradually downward, and the walls grew higher on either side, blocking out more and more of the sky until he felt like he was descending into the earth itself. The air grew cooler with each step, and there was a quality to the silence here that felt different from the dead quiet of the desert above. This silence had weight to it, presence. It was the silence of a place that did not want visitors. Jake's instincts, honed by war, in 2 years of wandering through territories where the wrong step could mean death, told him to turn back. He was trespassing here. This was someone's land, someone's sacred ground, and the fact that he could not see anyone watching did not mean they were not there. But thirst drove him forward. The knowledge that turning back meant certain death pushed him past the warnings his gut was screaming. He kept walking, kept following the canyon floor as it wound between walls of ancient red stone until he came around a curve and stopped dead. The gold was impossible to miss. A recent rain rare enough in this country to qualify as a miracle had washed away a section of the canyon wall, exposing what lay beneath the thin layer of desert soil. The vein ran through the stone like a river frozen in time, thick as a man's arm, gleaming with a light that seemed to come from within rather than reflecting the dim sun filtering down from above. Jake had seen gold before. He had spent 10 years working claims across the West, panning streams and digging shafts, finding just enough color to keep hope alive while the real fortunes always seemed to belong to someone else. He knew what gold looked like in all its forms, dust flake nugget. He knew how to estimate the value of a find by eye, how to judge the quality of ore, how to calculate what it would take to extract, and how much profit remained after expenses. What he was looking at now was more gold than he had seen in his entire life combined. His legs carried him forward without conscious direction, and his hand reached out to touch the vein before his mind caught up with what he was doing. The metal was cool beneath his fingers, smooth where the water had polished it, and so pure that he could see his own distorted reflection in its surface. This was it, the find that every prospector dreamed of, the motherlode that would turn a poor man into a king overnight. With this much gold, Jake could buy an army. He could hire detectives to track Silas Crane to the ends of the earth. He could ensure that his brother's killer never knew another peaceful moment for whatever remained of his miserable life. He could have everything he had ever wanted. The thought should have filled him with triumph. Instead, Jake felt something cold settle in his chest, a weight that pressed down on his heart with every heartbeat. He stared at the gold, and the gold stared back, and in its gleaming surface, he saw not his own reflection, but the faces of all the men he had known who had been destroyed by exactly this kind of fortune. His father had died of drink, poisoned by the dream of a strike that never came, spending his final years in a haze of whiskey and bitter disappointment, while his wife quietly slipped away to find someone who could offer more than broken promises. Jake had been 15 when he found the old man cold in his bed, an empty bottle clutched in one hand, and a worn map to a non-existent gold deposit in the other. The last lesson Thomas Coulter had taught his son was that the dream of wealth could kill just as surely as a bullet. And Sam had been chasing gold when he died. They both had. The modest haul in their saddlebags had seemed like a beginning, a foundation to build on, but in the end it had just been bait in a trap. Sam's optimism, Sam's belief that their luck was finally changing, had led them straight into Silas Crane's guns. Gold had killed Jake's father. Gold had killed his brother. And now here he stood alone in a sacred canyon on land that was not his, looking at more gold than most men saw in 10 lifetimes, and all he could feel was the weight of all that death pressing down on him. He dropped his hand from the vein and stepped back, his heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with dehydration or exhaustion. The gold continued to gleam in the dim light, patient and eternal, waiting for him to make his choice. It would be so easy to take it. Just break off a few pieces, fillet his pockets, stumble back to civilization and let the yellow metal buy him a new life. No one would ever know. The canyon would keep its secrets, and Jake would be free of the poverty and desperation that had defined his existence for as long as he could remember. But he would know. He would spend the rest of his life knowing that his fortune had been built on theft, that he had taken from people who had done nothing to him, that he had proven himself no better than Silas Crane. His father's words echoed in his mind, as they always did in moments like this. A man can lose money, lose land, lose his life, but don't ever lose your honor. That's the only thing that truly belongs to you. You already took everything else from me, Jake said aloud, his voice bouncing off the canyon walls in a whisper of echoes. He was talking to the gold, or maybe to his father's ghost, or maybe to the universe that had delivered him to this moment. You don't get this too. He crouched down and began gathering loose dirt and rocks, piling them over the exposed vein with hands that shook from more than just weakness. The work was slow and exhausting, requiring him to reach up above his head to cover the highest parts of the gold. But he kept at it until the gleaming metal was hidden beneath a layer of debris that looked natural enough to fool a casual observer. When he was done, he stood and looked at his work, The canyon wall appeared undisturbed, just another stretch of red rock among thousands like it. Unless someone knew exactly where to look, they would never find what lay beneath. Jake turned his back on the gold and walked away. His legs trembled with each step and his vision blurred at the edges from dehydration, but he kept moving, kept putting distance between himself and the fortune he had chosen to leave behind. He had gone maybe 100 yards when they appeared. 6 men materialized from the shadows of the canyon as if they had grown from the stone itself. They surrounded him in a loose semicircle, cutting off any possibility of retreat, and their weapons were drawn and ready. Not guns, but bows, arrows knocked and pointed at Jake's chest with a steadiness that spoke of long practice. Apache warriors. Jake recognized the style of their dress, the patterns painted on their faces, the particular way they moved through the landscape as if they owned it, which they did. This was their land, their sacred ground, and he was an intruder who had just been caught. Jake kept his hands well away from his gun. He had seen enough death to know when resistance was suicide, and this was exactly that situation. 6 arrows would find him before he could clear leather, and even if by some miracle he managed to shoot one of them, the other 5 would turn him into a pincushion before he hit the ground. The warrior at the center of the group was older than the others, maybe 50, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same red stone as the canyon walls. His eyes were dark and deep-set, and they studied Jake with the careful assessment of a man who had survived enough battles to know exactly how dangerous every stranger might be. He wore his years like armor each line, and scar a testament to victories won and enemies defeated. This was a chief or at least a war leader. Jake recognized the bearing, the unconscious authority that radiated from him like heat from a fire. He had seen the same quality in officers during the war, men who did not need to raise their voices or make threats because their very presence commanded obedience. The chief spoke in a language Jake did not understand, his voice low and measured, but the meaning was clear enough from the tone and the tightening of the bowstrings around him. He was being asked something, and the wrong answer would be his last. Jake raised his hands slowly, palms out, showing that he held no weapon. He kept his voice calm, unthreatening, the way he might speak to a spooked horse. "I mean no disrespect. I was lost dying of thirst. I stumbled in here by accident." The chief's expression did not change. "You speak English." It was not a question. The chief's English was clear and precise, spoken with an accent but perfectly understandable. Jake felt a small surge of hope. If they could communicate, there was at least a chance of talking his way out of this. "Yes, I'm alone. My horse is injured back up the canyon. I was looking for water." "You found more than water." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. The chief knew. Of course the chief knew these were his scouts, his warriors, and they had been watching since the moment Jake entered the canyon. Maybe longer. Maybe they had been tracking him across the desert for days, waiting to see what he would do. There was no point in lying. "I found gold, a vein in the wall exposed by the rain." A murmur passed through the warriors, sharp and dangerous. Hands tightened on bows. The young warrior on the far left, barely more than a boy, maybe 12 or 13, spat something in Apache that sounded like a curse. The chief silenced them with a gesture. His eyes had not left Jake's face. "And what did you take?" "Nothing." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting. "Nothing," the chief repeated. "You found gold, and you took nothing." "I covered it back up, left it where it was." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them. Jake could see the skepticism in the chief's eyes, the disbelief that any white man would walk away from a fortune. It was the same disbelief Jake had seen in his own mind when he made the choice, that voice whispering that he was a fool, that he would regret this for the rest of his life. "Because I've seen what gold does to people." Jake's voice was steady, though his heart was pounding. "It killed my father, not with a bullet, but slow with drink and broken dreams. It killed my brother 2 years ago. A man named Silas Crane murdered him for a few pounds of dust, shot him down like a dog on a Nevada road." The warriors exchanged glances. The chief's expression remained unreadable. "Gold destroys everything it touches," Jake continued. "It turns good men into monsters and monsters into bums. I spent 10 years chasing it, and all I have to show for that time is dead family and a list of regrets long enough to paper a house." He gestured toward the section of canyon where the vein lay hidden. "That gold doesn't belong to me. It belongs to this land, to your people. Taking it would make me no better than the man who killed my brother. And I won't let that happen. I won't let gold take one more thing from me." The chief studied him for a long moment. The arrows remained pointed at Jake's chest, but something had shifted in the air, a tension releasing, or perhaps just changing form. "You are different," the chief said finally. "Most white men would have died trying to carry as much gold as they could hold. They would have seen the arrows and still tried to run with their pockets full. I'm not most white men. No, you are not." The chief turned to the young warrior who had spat earlier and spoke a command in Apache. The boy's face twisted with obvious reluctance, but he lowered his bow and disappeared into the shadows of the canyon. "My scout will check your words. If you have lied, if even a single flake of gold is missing, you will die here. Your bones will join those of all the other thieves who have tried to take from this sacred ground." Jake nodded. "I haven't lied." The wait that followed was the longest of Jake's life. He stood motionless under the aim of 5 arrows, watching the chief's face for any sign of what was to come. The other warriors were statues, their discipline absolute, their attention never wavering. These were men who had spent their lives defending this land from invaders, and Jake had no illusions about what they would do to him if the scout returned with bad news. But he felt no fear. It was strange. He had been afraid of many things in his life, had known the cold grip of terror in battle, and the slow dread of poverty, and the aching emptiness of grief. But this moment, standing in a sacred canyon with his life balanced on the edge of other men's judgment, felt oddly peaceful. He had made his choice. Whatever happened next was beyond his control. The scout returned after what might have been 10 minutes or 10 hours. He emerged from the canyon shadows and approached the chief, speaking rapidly in Apache with animated gestures. Jake watched the chief's face, trying to read the verdict in those weathered features. When the scout finished his report, the chief was silent for several heartbeats. Then slowly he raised his hand. The warriors lowered their bows. "You spoke truth." The chief's voice carried a note of something that might have been surprise or might have been respect. "The gold is untouched. You covered it with your own hands carefully, as if you were burying something precious." "I was," Jake said. "I was burying a temptation." The chief nodded slowly. "Come, walk with me." It was not a request. Jake followed the chief deeper into the canyon, leaving the other warriors behind until they reached the section of wall where the gold lay hidden. The chief stood before it, looking at the pile of debris that Jake had constructed, and his face softened into something that was almost a smile. "Do you know what this place is? Sacred ground. I could feel it when I entered." "Yes, but more than that, this canyon is where my people come to speak with the spirits of our ancestors. The gold in these walls is not treasure to us. It is the blood of the earth, and it belongs to the earth. We do not take it because taking it would wound the land itself." He turned to face Jake. "For more than 100 years, white men have sought this gold. Miners, prospectors, soldiers. They have come with guns and greed, and they have all died here, their bones feeding the desert, their spirits restless because they never found what they sought." The chief stepped closer, his eyes locked on Jake's. "You are the first, the only one who has found the gold and walked away. Do you understand what that means?" Jake shook his head. "I only know that taking it felt wrong. It means you have honor. True honor, the kind that cannot be bought or traded or worn like a mask. You have the honor of a man who knows what is right and does it even when no one is watching, even when doing otherwise would be easier." He placed his hand on Jake's shoulder, and the weight of it felt like more than just physical contact. It felt like a judgment being rendered, a verdict being passed. "I am Kohana. I lead the people of this land. And I tell you now, Jake Coulter." Jake started at the sound of his name. He had not given it. Kohana smiled at his surprise. "We have watched you for longer than you know. Since you crossed into our territory, my scouts have followed your steps. We know your name, your quest, and your sorrow. We know about the brother you lost and the man you seek. Why? Because that is how we survive, by knowing everything about everyone who enters our land. Most of them we kill before they find what they are looking for. A few we allow to pass if they prove harmless. But you," Kohana shook his head slowly, "you are something new. What happens now? Now you live. My warriors will give you water and food enough to reach the white men's settlements. Your horse will be tended until she can travel. And when you leave this canyon, you will do so with my blessing and my warning." Jake waited for the warning, knowing it would come. "You have incurred a debt today," Kohana said. "Not to me, but to this land and everything it represents. You have proven yourself honorable, and that honor binds you as surely as any chain. One day, maybe soon, maybe in many years, that debt will come due. And when it does, you will be expected to honor it as you honored your word today." "What kind of debt?" Kohana's smile faded. "I do not know yet. Some debts take many seasons to reveal their true form. The earth does not forget what is owed, and neither do I. When the time comes, you will know." He turned and began walking back toward where the warriors waited. Jake followed his mind, churning with questions he did not know how to ask. What had he agreed to? What would be demanded of him? And why did this Apache chief, who had every reason to kill him, seem almost pleased that Jake had refused to take the gold? The answers would come, Kohana had said. But for now, Jake had done the only thing he could do. He had made a choice, and he would live with its consequences. The warriors gave him water, and he drank until his stomach cramped, then drank more. They gave him dried meat and a pouch of some kind of grain that tasted like nothing he had ever eaten but filled the hollow ache in his belly. One of them went to tend to Whiskey and returned with news that the mare's leg was not as badly injured as Jake had feared. With rest and proper care, she would recover. Jake spent 2 nights in the canyon sleeping under the watchful eyes of Kohana's scouts, regaining his strength. On the morning of the 3rd day, the chief came to him one final time. "The path east will take you out of our territory. Follow it and do not stray, and you will reach a white man's town within 4 days." Jake nodded. "I won't forget what happened here." "No, you will not, and neither will I." Kohana paused, and something shifted in his expression, a shadow passing across his features, a glimpse of some private grief. "I had a wife once. Her name was Mika. She was killed by white raiders 2 weeks before you stumbled into this canyon." Jake's blood went cold. "I'm sorry." "The men who killed her came from the same direction you came. They rode through our territory, burning and killing, and then they fled before we could catch them. My wife died protecting our daughter, a child of 5 summers, who now grows up without a mother." He met Jake's eyes, and there was no accusation in his gaze, but there was something else, a knowledge, a weight. The world is full of men who hurt others for profit, but it is also full of men like you who refuse to take what is not theirs, even when taking would be easy. That is why I let you live, Jake Coulter. Not because you are innocent, but because you have proven you are capable of being good." Jake did not know what to say. The image of a 5-year-old girl losing her mother to violence hit too close to the memories of his own losses, opened wounds he had thought were scarred over. Kohana turned and walked away without another word. Jake watched him go, then mounted Whiskey and began the long ride east towards civilization and whatever waited for him there. He did not look back at the canyon. He did not need to. He knew he would carry it with him for the rest of his life, the gold he had left behind, the debt he had incurred, and the strange certainty that his path and Kohana's would cross again someday. What he did not know, could not have known, was that from high on the canyon rim, a small figure was watching him leave. A girl of 5 with eyes that had seen too much death and a heart that had learned too young what it meant to hate. She had been there when her mother died, hiding in a crack in the rocks, watching helplessly as the white men burned her world to ash. And she had seen something else that day. A different white man standing on a hill overlooking the carnage, his face twisted with an emotion she could not name. He had not been one of the raiders, he had not participated in the killing, but he had not helped either. He had just stood there watching until the violence was over, and then he had ridden away. The girl had never forgotten his face. The gray-blue eyes that had seemed to look right through her, the expression of horror that had not translated into action. She did not know his name, did not know his story, knew only that he had been there and had done nothing. Now, watching the man called Jake Coulter ride away from the canyon, she felt something stir in her chest. He had the same gray-blue eyes, the same lean build. He could have been the man on the hill, or he could have been someone else entirely. At 5 years old, all white men looked somewhat alike to her, and memory was an unreliable witness. But she would remember him anyway. She would remember this day and the debt her father said he owed, and the way her heart burned with questions she was too young to ask. 13 years would pass before she saw him again. And when she did, she would not be a child anymore. She would be a woman forged in grief and hardened by hatred, and she would come to him with a purpose that had nothing to do with debts or honor. She would come to destroy him, or so she thought. The years between 1875 and 1888 passed like water through Jake Coulter's fingers, sometimes rushing, sometimes slow, always flowing toward an end he could not see. He never stopped searching for Silas Crane. The quest took him from Arizona to Colorado, from New Mexico to Kansas, following leads that went cold and rumors that dissolved into nothing. Crane was a ghost, a shadow, a name whispered in saloons and bunkhouses, but never attached to a man who could be found. The outlaw had gone to ground after the Nevada robbery, or had moved on to territories where Jake could not follow, or had died in some unmarked grave without anyone knowing to notify the brother of his victim. Jake did not give up, but somewhere along the way the search stopped being the center of his existence and became just one thread among many in the fabric of his life. He worked ranches across the Southwest, earning enough to keep himself fed and his horse shod, building a reputation as a quiet man who did his job and did not cause trouble. He made few friends and no enemies, passing through towns and camps like a stranger who never quite belonged. In 1880, he found a piece of land that no one else wanted. It sat in a valley just east of Apache territory, too close to danger for most settlers, too far from towns and railroads for anyone with commercial ambitions. The soil was rocky, the water scarce, and the nearest neighbor was a full day's ride away. Jake bought it for almost nothing and spent 3 years building a cabin with his own hands. He felled the trees himself, dragged the logs to the site, notched and stacked them until walls rose up around him like a testament to his refusal to quit. He dug a well that took 6 months of back-breaking labor before it finally hit water. He built fences from wood and wire, created a small corral for horses, cleared enough land to run a modest herd of cattle. The work was hard, lonely, and exactly what he needed. Every swing of the axe, every post driven into the ground, every blister and ache and moment of exhaustion was a reminder that he was still alive, still capable of creating something instead of just destroying. The ranch was not much, a few acres of hard-won civilization carved out of wilderness, but it was his. He had built it without help, without gold, without anything but his own 2 hands and the stubborn will to survive. Doc McAllister found him in the winter of 1882 during a blizzard that trapped Jake in his half-finished cabin for nearly 2 weeks. The old man had been traveling through when the storm hit, and Jake's homestead was the only shelter for miles. They spent those 2 weeks playing cards by candlelight, sharing whiskey that Doc had brought from town, and discovering that they had more in common than either would have expected. Doc was 62, then a former Army surgeon who had seen the worst of the Civil War and emerged with his skills intact, but his faith in humanity shattered. He had drifted west after the war, looking for a place where the horrors he had witnessed might fade from memory. He had never found that place, but he had found a kind of peace in being useful, setting broken bones, delivering babies, treating the endless parade of injuries and illnesses that plagued frontier life. "You've got the look of a man running from something," Doc had said on their 3rd night together when the whiskey had loosened both their tongues. Jake had not denied it. "Running towards something too, or I was. These days I'm not sure what I'm doing. The search for meanings is the only search worth undertaking, and the only one that never really ends." They had become friends after that, the only real friend Jake had made since Sam died. Doc visited the ranch every few months, sometimes staying for days, sometimes just passing through on his way to some distant patient. They talked about everything and nothing, shared silences that required no explanation, and slowly built the kind of bond that men form when they recognize in each other a kindred wound. "You need a wife," Doc told him in the summer of 1886, watching Jake struggle with a fence that really required 2 people to build. Jake had laughed, a sound he made so rarely that it surprised even him. "I had a family once. It didn't work out." That wasn't a family. That was a brother and a ghost of a father and a mother who ran. A wife is something different. A wife is someone who chooses you and you choose her, and you build something together that neither of you could build alone. "You ever have a wife?" Doc's face had gone distant. "Once, before the war. She died of cholera while I was away playing surgeon in a field hospital. By the time I got home, she had been in the ground for 3 months. I'm sorry." "So am I, every day. But that doesn't mean I was wrong to try, and it doesn't mean you'd be wrong to try either. A man isn't meant to be alone, Jake, even a man like you. Jake had not argued, but he had not agreed either. The idea of letting someone into his life, of creating new vulnerabilities after he had worked so hard to protect himself from further loss, seemed like madness. He had built his ranch as a fortress, a place where he could live out his days in solitude, answerable to no one, responsible for no one. The thought of tearing down those walls terrified him more than any enemy ever had. The years continued to pass. The cabin grew into something that could almost be called a home. The herd expanded slowly, one or two head at a time, until Jake had enough cattle to make a modest living if he managed them well. He added a small barn, a smokehouse, a root cellar for winter storage. Each improvement was another brick in the wall between himself and the world, another reason to believe that he could survive without needing anyone. And then in the spring of 1888, everything changed. Jake was mending a section of fence when he saw them, three riders approaching from the west, their silhouettes dark against the afternoon sun. His hand went to his gun automatically, an instinct so ingrained that he did not even think about it anymore. Strangers meant potential trouble, and in this isolated valley, trouble could mean death. As they drew closer, he recognized the lead rider and felt the world shift beneath his feet. Kohana. 13 years had aged. The Apache chief deepened the lines in his face and added silver to his hair, but the bearing was unchanged. He rode like a man who owned the land and everything on it, with the unconscious authority that Jake remembered from their encounter in the sacred canyon. Time had not diminished him. If anything, it had concentrated him, distilled him into something purer and more formidable. Behind him rode two others, a young warrior in his mid-20s, handsome and fierce, with eyes that regarded Jake with open suspicion, and a woman. Jake's breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful in a way that went beyond physical features, though those were striking enough: high cheekbone skin, the color of burnished copper hair, as black as a raven's wing. But what held Jake's attention was the fire in her eyes, a blaze of emotion so intense that it seemed to heat the air around her. She looked at him the way one might look at a cockroach discovered in a kitchen, with disgust, contempt, and a burning desire to crush. He had never met her before. He was certain of that. And yet something about her gaze felt familiar, as if she had been looking at him with those hate-filled eyes for far longer than the few seconds since she had ridden into view. Kohana stopped his horse a few feet from where Jake stood and dismounted with the fluid grace of a much younger man. The other two remained in their saddles, the young warrior's hand resting on the knife at his belt, the woman's fingers white-knuckled on her reins. Jake Coulter. Kohana's voice had not changed either, still that same measured tone, calm and certain. 13 years. You have built much. Jake found his voice. Kohana, I didn't expect to see you again. No, but the earth does not forget what is owed, and the time has come to settle our accounts. The words echoed in Jake's memory, the warning Kohana had given him in the canyon so many years ago. Some debts take many seasons to reveal their true form. When the time comes, you will know. What kind of debt requires payment after 13 years? Kohana did not answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the woman, who dismounted with a grace that matched his own. She stood beside her horse, still looking at Jake with that incandescent hatred, her entire body vibrating with suppressed emotion. This is my daughter, Winona. She was 5 years old when you passed through our canyon. Now she is a woman 18 summers old, trained as a warrior and wise beyond her years. Jake remembered the child on the canyon rim, the small figure watching him ride away. This was her, grown and transformed by time into something fierce and dangerous. She is my only child, Kohana continued. Her mother died when she was young, killed by white raiders who came through our territory like a plague. Winona has carried that grief for 13 years, and it has shaped her into what you see now. Jake's throat tightened. He remembered Kohana telling him about his wife, about the raid that had taken her life. He had not made the connection then, had not understood that the 5-year-old girl watching from the canyon rim was the same child who had lost her mother to violence. I am sorry for her loss, but I don't understand what this has to do with our debt. Kohana smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The debt is this: 13 years ago, you proved that you were a man of honor. You walked away from gold that would have made you wealthy beyond imagining, because taking it would have violated your principles. That honor created a bond between us, a bond that I now call upon. He paused, and his next words fell like stones into still water. I am giving you my daughter. The silence that followed was absolute. Jake stared at Kohana, certain he had misheard. The young warrior behind them made a sound of protest quickly stifled. And Winona's hatred seemed to crystallize into something even more intense, a fury so pure that Jake could almost feel it burning his skin. Your, what? Winona will stay with you. She will live under your roof, share your food, and be called your wife in the eyes of both our peoples. This is the payment for the debt you incurred when you chose honor over gold. Jake shook his head, backing up a step without realizing it. No, I can't. She clearly doesn't want this, and I don't need. What you need is not the question, Kahana interrupted. The question is what is owed and how it will be paid. You proved yourself honorable once. Now you will prove it again by accepting this responsibility and treating my daughter with the respect she deserves. Respect, Jake's voice rose. You call this respect giving her to a stranger against her will. She is not given as a possession. She is given as a test. The words came from Winona herself the first time she had spoken. Her voice was low and controlled, but underneath the control, Jake could hear the barely restrained fury. My father believes you are worthy of honor. He has believed it for 13 years, based on one moment in a canyon when you chose to leave gold behind. I do not share his belief. I think you are like all white men, weak, greedy, and capable of honor only when it costs you nothing. She stepped toward him, and Jake found himself backing up another pace despite himself. So I have come to test you, to live under your roof and watch your every action and wait for you to prove my father wrong about you. And when you fail, because you will fail, I will tell him, and this debt will be erased in a different way. Her eyes bored into his. I am not a gift, Jake Coulter. I am a judgment, and I am looking forward to watching you fall. Jake looked from Winona to Kohana, searching for some explanation that made sense. The chief's face was unreadable, a mask of stone that gave away nothing. This is madness. She hates me. She doesn't want to be here. How is forcing her to stay against her will supposed to pay any kind of debt? She is not forced, Kohana said. She has chosen this. She could have refused, and I would have accepted her decision. But Winona is her mother's daughter. She does not shy away from challenges, even ones that cause her pain. And you, Jake turned back to Winona, you chose this, chose to live with a stranger you despise. Her chin lifted. I chose to expose you, to prove that my father's faith in white men's honor is misplaced. You will slip eventually. You will reveal what you really are. And when you do, I will be there to see it. The conviction in her voice left no room for argument. She believed what she was saying with every fiber of her being, believed that Jake was a fraud, that his moment of honor in the canyon had been a fluke or a trick, that given enough time, he would prove himself as corrupt as she expected all white men to be. And Jake could not entirely blame her. If he had watched his mother at the hands of white raiders, if he had grown up with that trauma shaping his understanding of the world, he might hate all white men too. He might spend his life waiting for them to confirm his worst expectations. But he was not going to give her what she wanted. Whatever test this was, whatever game Kohana was playing, Jake would not fail it by sending her away. Fine, he heard himself say. You can stay, but I have conditions. Winona's eyes narrowed. You are not in a position to make demands. I'm not demanding, I'm offering. You want to test me, fine, but I won't have you sleeping in the dirt while you do it. You take the cabin. I'll sleep in the barn. You can come and go as you please, and if at any point you decide you've seen enough, you can leave. No questions, no arguments, no attempts to make you stay. Does that sound fair? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She glanced at her father, then back at Jake, her expression flickering with something that might have been confusion. You would give up your home for me. I would give you what you need to feel safe enough to make a real judgment. If I'm the monster you think I am, keeping you uncomfortable and vulnerable won't hide that. And if I'm not, he shrugged, then you might as well find out in a situation where you have the freedom to see clearly. Kohana made a sound that might have been approval. You see, daughter, this is why I trust him. He does not think of himself first. Winona's face hardened again, the brief moment of uncertainty disappearing behind the mask of hatred. We will see. Words are easy, actions are what matter. Then watch my actions, for as long as you need to. He held out his hand in offer of peace of beginning. Winona looked at it as if it were a coiled snake, then turned and walked past him toward the cabin without a word. The young warrior who had remained silent throughout the exchange made a move as if to follow her, but Kohana stopped him with a gesture. Chayton will return to our people. Winona will stay. The test begins now, Jake Coulter. Do not disappoint me. Without another word, Kohana remounted his horse. The young warrior Chayton gave Jake one last look of pure venom before doing the same. Then they were riding away back toward the west, leaving Jake standing in his yard with a woman who hated him living in his house. He stood there until they disappeared over the horizon, trying to understand what had just happened. 13 years ago, he had walked away from gold because taking it felt wrong. That single decision had rippled forward through time, creating consequences he could never have imagined, leading to this moment when a grieving chief delivered his daughter like a verdict to be rendered. From inside the cabin, he heard the sound of Winona moving around, exploring the space that was now hers. He wondered what she thought of his home, the rough-hewn furniture he had built himself, the spare decorations, the bachelor's existence, evident in every corner. He wondered if she would find what she was looking for, if she would discover the monster she expected him to be. He wondered if she was right to look for it. Jake turned and walked toward the barn, leaving his cabin to the woman who had come to judge him. The sun was setting over the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote was beginning its evening song. The first night of his test had begun, and he had no idea how to pass it. He lay awake in the barn loft that night, listening to the small sounds of his ranch settling into darkness. The horses shifted in their stalls below. An owl called from somewhere in the trees, and from the direction of the cabin, so faint he might have imagined it, the sound of someone crying. The sound was muffled, restrained, as if the person making it was fighting hard to keep it contained. But in the stillness of the night, even the smallest sounds carried, and Jake knew what he was hearing. Winona was weeping. His first instinct was to go to her to offer whatever comfort he could, but he suppressed it immediately. She had not asked for his comfort. She had not asked for anything from him except the chance to prove that he was unworthy. Going to her now, intruding on her private grief, would only confirm what she already believed, that white men did not respect boundaries, did not understand the concept of space. So he lay in the darkness and listened to her cry, and he remembered his own nights of weeping after Sam died. The way grief came in waves, sometimes expected and sometimes ambushing him without warning. The terrible loneliness of mourning someone while surrounded by people who had never known them, who could not understand the shape of the hole their absence left behind. Winona had lost her mother 13 years ago, and she had been carrying that loss ever since. Whatever else she was, warrior, judge, adversary, she was also a young woman whose childhood had been shattered by violence she could not prevent. Jake knew something about that, knew what it was like to watch someone you loved die while you stood helpless to stop it. Maybe that was why Kahana had sent her here. Not just to test Jake's honor, but to find some common ground between two people who had both been broken by loss. Maybe the old chief was wiser than Jake had given him credit for, playing a game whose rules Jake did not yet understand. Or maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe this was exactly what it appeared to be, a test of character, nothing more or less. Either way, Jake would face it the same way he faced everything, one day at a time, one choice at a time, hoping that the sum of those choices would add up to something he could live with. The crying from the cabin faded, eventually replaced by the deeper silence of exhausted sleep. Jake closed his eyes and tried to do the same, but rest was slow in coming. When it finally arrived, he dreamed of gold, of a canyon filled with it, so much gold that it spilled out of the walls and flooded the floor, and rose around him like water, threatening to drown him in its gleaming embrace. And standing at the edge of the flood, watching him struggle, was a woman with hate in her eyes and a question on her lips. Are you worthy of so? He woke before dawn as he always did and began the long work of proving his answer. The first week passed like a slow war of attrition, each day a battlefield where neither combatant was willing to surrender ground. Winona rose before dawn, as Jake did, but she made certain to be outside and working before he emerged from the barn. She had claimed the cabin as her territory, and she defended it with the fierce determination of a soldier holding a fortified position. When Jake needed something from inside, a tool, a piece of clothing, food from the stores he had laid in for winter, he found himself hesitating at the door, knocking like a visitor in his own home. She never told him he could not enter. She did not need to. The contempt in her eyes when he crossed the threshold was eloquent enough, a silent condemnation that made every trip inside feel like an invasion. Jake adapted. He moved most of his belongings to the barn, created a small living space in the loft where he could sleep and eat without disturbing her. He took his meals outside when the weather permitted, sitting on a stump near the corral and watching the sun move across the sky while he chewed jerky and hardtack. It was not comfortable, but comfort had never been something Jake prioritized. Survival was what mattered, and survival sometimes meant accepting conditions that would break a softer man. Winona watched him with the intensity of a hawk tracking prey. He could feel her eyes on him whenever he worked mending fences, tending the cattle, splitting wood for the winter that was still months away. She observed his every action, cataloging his movements, waiting for the slip that would confirm her suspicions. She cooked her own meals, refusing to share food with him even when he offered. She washed her own clothes in the creek behind the cabin, carried her own water, chopped her own firewood. Every act of self-sufficiency was a declaration of independence, a reminder that she needed nothing from him and would accept nothing she did not absolutely require. Jake let her be. He understood the impulse behind her behavior, the need to maintain control in a situation where she had been placed against her will, even if that placement had technically been her choice. She was building walls just as he had built walls, and he knew from experience that walls could only be dismantled from the inside. On the fourth day, he found her struggling with a fence post that had come loose during a storm. The post was too heavy for one person to lift while simultaneously packing dirt around its base, and she had been wrestling with it for nearly an hour when Jake walked past on his way to check on the cattle. He stopped, watched, made a decision. Without a word, he crossed to where she stood bent down and gripped the post with both hands. His muscles strained as he lifted it into the proper position, holding it steady while she stared at him with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Her hands did not move. She stood frozen, clearly torn between accepting help she needed and rejecting assistance from the enemy. Jake waited. The post was heavy and his arms were beginning to shake with the effort of holding it, but he did not speak, did not pressure her, simply held the wood in place and let her make her own choice. After what felt like an eternity, Winona's hands began to move. She packed dirt around the base of the post with quick, efficient motions, tamping it down until the wood stood firm on its own. When she finished, Jake released his grip and stepped back. She did not thank him. He did not expect her to. But that night, for the first time since her arrival, he found a plate of food waiting for him outside the barn door. Venison stew, still warm with chunks of wild onion and some herb he did not recognize. It was the most delicious meal he had eaten in months. He left the empty plate by the cabin door the next morning. When he returned from his work that evening, it was gone and another meal was waiting in its place. They did not speak of this arrangement. It simply existed, a small bridge across the chasm between them, too fragile to bear the weight of words. The second week brought changes so subtle that Jake almost missed them. Winona stopped retreating into the cabin whenever he approached. She began working in the open, tending a small garden she had started near the creek, and she no longer turned her back when he passed by. The hatred in her eyes remained, but it had cooled slightly, transforming from a raging fire into something more like banked coals, still hot, still dangerous, but no longer threatening to consume everything it touched. Jake found himself watching her work with something that might have been admiration. She moved with an efficiency that spoke of long practice, her hands, sure and skilled, as they coaxed life from the rocky soil. The garden was ambitious for such poor land, but she seemed determined to make it flourish through sheer force of will. One afternoon, he paused near the garden on his way back from the pasture, genuinely curious about what she was growing. She noticed his attention and stiffened her hands, going still on the trowel she was using. Her eyes met his with the familiar challenge, daring him to say something she could use against him. Jake kept his voice neutral, conversational. My mother used to garden before she left. I remember watching her work, but I never learned how to do it myself. Winona said nothing. Her fingers tightened on the trowel. If you need anything, seeds, tools, whatever, I can pick them up next time I go to town. Just let me know. He walked away before she could respond, leaving the offer hanging in the air between them. It was not much, but it was something, an acknowledgement that her presence here had value, that her efforts to create something on his land were welcome rather than merely tolerated. That evening, he found a list tucked under the plate outside the barn. Seeds she wanted written in a hand that was elegant despite its unfamiliarity with English letters. Squash, beans, corn. The three sisters, he realized the traditional crops of her people grown together in a way that benefited all three. He tucked the list into his pocket and felt something shift in his chest. A wall crumbling, perhaps, or just a crack forming in the stone. Doc McAllister arrived on the 15th day, his old gray horse picking its way up the trail with the casual familiarity of an animal that had made this journey many times before. Jake was splitting wood when he heard the hoofbeats, and he set down his axe with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Doc was the closest thing he had to a friend in this territory, but Doc was also observant, curious, and entirely too willing to ask questions that Jake did not want to answer. The old man dismounted with a grunt, his joints protesting the movement in a way that had become more pronounced over the past few years. At 65, Doc McAllister was held together by stubbornness and whiskey, and he made no secret of the fact that he expected each winter might be his last. His eyes swept across the ranch, taking in the details, with the practiced assessment of a man who had spent decades reading situations at a glance. They lingered on the garden near the creek, on the smoke rising from the cabin chimney, on the small signs of habitation that had not been present during his last visit. Then they found Jake, and a slow smile spread across the weathered face. Well, well, either you've developed a sudden interest in horticulture, or there's something you haven't told me. Jake wiped his hands on his trousers and walked to meet his friend. Doc, good to see you. Don't change the subject. Doc's eyes twinkled with amusement. Last time I was here, you couldn't keep a cactus alive. Now you've got a garden that would make a farmer weep with envy. Want to explain that? Before Jake could answer, the cabin door opened and Winona emerged. She had been inside when Doc arrived, but she must have heard the conversation through the walls. Now she stood in the doorway, her posture defensive, her eyes evaluating this new arrival with the same suspicion she had shown Jake. Doc's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. He looked from Winona to Jake and back again, his expression shifting through several emotions before settling on something that might have been approval. Well, I'll be damned. You actually did it. Did what? Found yourself a woman, and a beautiful one at that. Doc swept his hat off his head in a gesture of respect. Ma'am, I'm Ezra McAllister. Most folks call me Doc. I've been patching up this stubborn fool for the better part of 6 years, and I have to say you're the best improvement I've seen him make in all that time. Winona's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes, surprise perhaps at being addressed with such casual courtesy. She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the introduction without committing to conversation. Doc turned back to Jake, his voice dropping to a murmur that would not carry to the cabin. Apache, Kohana's daughter. The name meant something to Doc. Jake had told him about the canyon, about the gold, about the debt that had hung over him for 13 years. The old man's face went through another series of expressions, this time ending in something more complicated. The debt came due, in a manner of speaking. Doc studied him for a long moment, reading things in Jake's face that Jake himself might not have been able to articulate. Then he nodded slowly as if reaching some private conclusion. Well, I brought whiskey. Seems like you might need it more than usual. They sat outside as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, sharing a bottle and watching the sky change colors. Winona had retreated back into the cabin after Doc's arrival, but Jake could feel her presence, knew she was listening through the walls to every word they spoke. He did not mind. If she wanted to understand him, eavesdropping on his conversations with the only friend he had seemed as good a method as any. Doc poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a tin cup and handed it over. So, you want to tell me what's really going on here? Jake took a drink, letting the burn spread through his chest before answering. Kohana showed up 2 weeks ago, brought his daughter, said it was time to pay my debt. And the payment was taking her in. The payment was proving I'm worthy of the honor he showed me 13 years ago. Winona's here to judge whether I succeed or fail. Doc whistled low. That's a hell of a test. She hates me. Hates all white men, really. Her mother was killed by raiders when she was 5, and she's spent her whole life since then nursing that wound. Can't blame her for that. I don't. But it makes this situation complicated. They drank in silence for a while, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. A coyote called from somewhere in the hills, its voice lonely and wild. You know what I think? Doc's voice was thoughtful, measured. I think that old chief knows exactly what he's doing. He's not just testing you, he's trying to heal her. Jake frowned. How do you figure? Think about it. She spent 13 years hating white men convinced they're all monsters. That kind of hatred eats a person from the inside out. It's a poison that kills slow but kills sure. Doc took a long pull from his cup. Kohana knows his daughter is dying from that poison, so he sends her to live with the one white man he's seen act with honor. Not to punish her, but to show her that her beliefs might be wrong. Or to confirm them if I fail. Sure, that's the risk. But I don't think Kohana would take that risk unless he believed in you. Unless he thought you had a real chance of changing her mind. Jake stared into his whiskey, watching the amber liquid catch the fading light. I don't know how to change anyone's mind about anything. You don't have to change her mind. You just have to be yourself. If who you are is the man who walked away from gold because taking it felt wrong, then that's enough. She'll see it eventually. And if she doesn't, Doc shrugged, then at least you'll know you tried. The measure of a man isn't whether he succeeds, it's whether he makes the attempt, despite knowing he might fail. The words settled into Jake's chest, joining the collection of wisdom that Doc had shared over the years. He did not know if he believed them, but he wanted to. That had to count for something. There's something else, Jake said quietly. Something I haven't told anyone. Doc waited patient as always. The day Winona's mother died, the ray that killed her, I was there. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the coyote had gone quiet, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I was riding through Apache territory 2 weeks before I found the gold in the canyon. I heard screaming, saw smoke. I rode to the top of a hill and looked down into a village that was being torn apart by raiders. Jake's voice was flat, emotionless, reciting facts he had replayed in his mind 1,000 times. There were at least 15 of them. Armed, organized, professional. I had one pistol with 6 shots. What did you do? Nothing. The word tasted like ash in Jake's mouth. I sat on that hill and watched them burn everything. Watched them kill everything they could catch. Watched a woman, Winona's mother I know now, die trying to protect her child. He drained his whiskey in one long swallow. I could have ridden down there. Could have died fighting even if I couldn't have saved anyone. But I made a calculation. I told myself that throwing my life away wouldn't help anyone, that the smart play was to wait and survive and maybe find help. But the truth is I was afraid. Afraid to die for strangers. Afraid to risk everything for people I'd never met. Doc was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. That's not cowardice, Jake. That's survival. Is there a difference? There is. Cowardice is running when you could make a difference. What you described, one man against 15, that's not a fight anyone could win. You would have died and so would everyone else. The only difference would have been one more body in the ashes. Tell that to the 5-year-old girl hiding in the rocks, watching her mother get murdered, while a stranger sat on a hill and did nothing. Jake, Winona was there. She saw me. She doesn't know it was me, doesn't recognize my face after 13 years, but she remembers. She told me about it a few nights ago. Described the man on the hill with gray-blue eyes who watched and did nothing. Jake laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. She's here to judge whether I'm worthy of honor, and I'm carrying the secret that I'm the very monster she thinks all white men are. Doc absorbed this in silence. The stars were fully out now, scattered across the sky like spilled diamonds, beautiful and cold and indifferent to the struggles of the men beneath them. Are you going to tell her? Jake had asked himself that question 100 times since Winona's arrival. The answer changed depending on the hour, the day, his mood. Sometimes he thought confession was the only honorable path. Other times he convinced himself that the truth would only cause more pain, that some secrets were better left buried. I don't know. I don't know if telling her would help or destroy whatever fragile peace we've started to build. I don't know if she could ever forgive me, or if forgiveness is even possible for something like this. Do you want her forgiveness? The question cut to the heart of something Jake had been avoiding. He turned it over in his mind, examining it from different angles, trying to find an honest answer. I want her to be free, he said finally. free of the hatred that's consuming her, free of the past that's keeping her trapped. If that requires my confession, then I'll confess. If it requires my silence, then I'll stay silent. Whatever helps her heal, that's what I want. Doc nodded slowly. That might be the most selfless thing I've ever heard you say. Or the most foolish. Often the same thing. Doc poured himself another drink. You know what I've learned in 65 years of living? The truth has a way of coming out whether we want it to or not. If you're carrying this secret, it won't stay buried forever. Better to control when and how it's revealed than to have it explode at the worst possible moment. Jake knew Doc was right. He had known it since the night Winona told him about the man on the hill. But knowing and acting were different things, separated by a chasm of fear and uncertainty that he did not know how to cross. I'll tell her, he said, soon, when the time is right. Doc raised his cup in a mock toast. Dumb. To courage, then, and to the hope that she's strong enough to hear it. They drank together as the night deepened around them, two men sharing the silence of an understanding that went beyond words. Inside the cabin, behind the walls that were not as thick as they seemed, Winona sat in the darkness and listened. She had heard everything, the confession, the fear, the hope. She did not know yet what to do with this information, did not know how to reconcile the monster she had imagined with the man Jake described. But something was shifting inside her, a foundation cracking, a certainty beginning to crumble. She lay awake long after the conversation outside ended, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling of the cabin, and wondered if everything she believed might be wrong. The third week brought unexpected visitors and unexpected violence. Jake was returning from the eastern pasture where he had been checking on a heifer that had wandered away from the herd when he heard the gunshots. They came from the direction of the Henderson homestead, a small farm about half a day's ride from his own property. Tom Henderson was a decent man, with a wife and two young children, struggling to carve a living out of land that did not want to be farmed. Jake had met him only twice brief encounters in town, when both men were picking up supplies. They were not friends. Jake did not have friends except for Doc, but they were neighbors in the loose sense that word had, in a territory where properties were measured in miles rather than acres. The gunshots continued sporadic but persistent, punctuated by shouts that Jake could not quite make out. Whatever was happening at the Henderson place, it was not a hunting party or target practice. It was trouble. Jake's first instinct was to ride toward home to check on Winona and make sure she was safe. But the Hendersons were in the opposite direction, and the sounds of violence were growing more desperate by the minute. He thought of the hill overlooking the Apache village, the woman dying while he watched. The choice he had made to preserve himself rather than risk everything for strangers. Not this time. He kicked his horse into a gallop, drawing his pistol as he rode. The wind tore at his face and his heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination that felt like old friends reuniting after a long separation. The Henderson homestead came into view around a bend in the trail, a small cabin, a half-finished barn, a corral with a few horses milling nervously. 4 men on horseback were circling the property, taking shots at the cabin, while a 5th man tried to break down the door. Bandits. The same breed of predator that had killed Sam, that had murdered Winona's mother, that thrived in territories where the law was thin and justice was whatever you could take by force. Jake did not slow down. He did not announce his presence or give the outlaws a chance to surrender. He had learned during the war that hesitation cost lives, and he had no intention of letting the Hendersons pay the price for his caution. His first shot took the man at the door through the back of the head. The bandit dropped without a sound, his body crumpling against the wood he had been trying to splinter. The others wheeled toward the sound of the shot, surprise and confusion on their faces. Jake used that moment to close the distance, firing twice more as he rode. One bullet found its mark in a bandit's chest. The other went wide, punching a hole through the air where a man's head had been a split second before. 3 down, 2 to go. The odds had shifted, but Jake was exposed now, charging across open ground with no cover and enemies who were recovering from their shock. A bullet whizzed past his ear close enough that he felt the heat of its passage. Another kicked up dirt near his horse's hooves. Jake threw himself from the saddle, hitting the ground in a roll that brought him up behind a water trough with his pistol ready. The 2 remaining bandits had separated, trying to flank him. One was moving toward the barn, The other was circling around the corral. Classic pincer movement, the kind of tactic that worked well against inexperienced opponents. Jake was not inexperienced. He waited until the man near the barn committed to his position, then rose from behind the trough and fired. The shot caught the bandit in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying. Before the man could recover, Jake was moving, crossing the distance between them in a sprint that ended with the butt of his pistol connecting with the bandit's temple. 4 down. The last man had used Jake's distraction to get close to the cabin. He grabbed Martha Henderson as she emerged from the door, wrapping his arm around her throat and pressing a pistol to her head. "Drop it!" The bandit's voice was high with panic, the voice of a man who had watched his entire gang get dismantled in less than a minute. "Drop the gun, or I swear to God I'll—" Jake did not let him finish the threat. His arm moved in a blur, the kind of motion that could only be achieved through years of practice and the cold clarity that came from having nothing left to lose. The bullet took the bandit in the shoulder of his gun arm. His pistol discharged harmlessly into the ground as he screamed and released Martha, who stumbled away from him and collapsed against the cabin wall. Jake crossed the remaining distance and drove his fist into the wounded man's face with every ounce of strength he possessed. The bandit went down and didn't get up. Silence fell over the homestead, broken only by the sound of frightened horses and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Tom Henderson emerged from the cabin, a rifle in his hands and a look of stunned disbelief on his face. His children peered out from behind him, a boy of about 8 and a girl no older than 5, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that would probably haunt their dreams for years. "Mr. Coulter," Henderson's voice was shaking. We thought—" Jake holstered his pistol and turned to check on Martha, who was sitting against the cabin wall with her hand pressed to her throat. She was pale and trembling, but otherwise uninjured. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" She shook her head, unable to speak. Her eyes were fixed on Jake with an expression he could not quite identify, gratitude, maybe mixed with something that looked almost like awe. "They came out of nowhere to show him." Henderson had found his voice, though it still wavered. 4 of them, no 5, they just rode up and started shooting. I got the family inside, but they wouldn't leave. Said they wanted everything we had. They won't be wanting anything else. Jake looked at the bodies scattered around the property. 2 dead for certain, 1 probably dying from the chest wound, 2 unconscious. You'll need to ride to town, report this to whoever passes for law around here. I'll stay until you get back. Make sure no one else comes looking for trouble." Henderson nodded rapidly, still processing what had just happened. "How did you— why—" "I heard the shots. Came to see what was wrong. You could have been killed." Jake thought about the hill, about the village burning below, about all the things he had not done when he had the chance. Some things are worth the risk. He did not stay for thanks or a conversation. Once Henderson rode off toward town and Martha had calmed enough to look after her children, Jake mounted his horse and began the long ride home. The sun was setting by the time he reached his property, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for a day that had contained so much violence. He was exhausted, his muscles aching from the fight, his mind replaying the sequence of events over and over. Winona was waiting for him. She stood at the edge of the corral, watching him approach with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not hatred, not contempt, something else entirely. Something that looked almost like respect. "You killed men today." It was not a question. Jake dismounted slowly, his joints protesting the movement. "Some. Wounded others?" "The Henderson family. I saw you ride toward the gunshots. I followed." Jake's head snapped up. "You followed me?" "From a distance. I saw everything." Her voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of something new in it. "You did not hesitate. You rode into battle against 5 armed men to protect strangers. They needed help. Many people need help. Most who could provide it do not." Jake did not know how to respond to that, so he said nothing. He led his horse toward the barn, intending to brush her down and check for injuries, but Winona followed him. "Why?" The question seemed to burst out of her against her will. "Why would you risk your life for people you barely know? What do you gain from it?" Jake paused at the barn door, considering his answer. The truth was complicated, a tangle of guilt and redemption, and the desperate need to prove to himself that he was not the coward who had watched from the hilltop 13 years ago. "Because I've seen what happens when no one helps," he said finally. I've watched people die because the ones who could have saved them decided it wasn't their problem. I've been that person, the one who looked away because getting involved seemed too dangerous. He turned to face her, meeting her eyes with an honesty that felt like stripping away armor. I can't change the past, can't undo the things I've failed to do, but I can choose what I do now. And I choose to help when I can, even if it kills me, because living with another failure would be worse than dying. Winona stared at him for a long moment. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes, those fierce, burning eyes, were softer than Jake had ever seen them. "You are not what I expected," she said quietly. Then she turned and walked back toward the cabin, leaving Jake alone with his horse and his thoughts and the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being seen. That night, there was no plate waiting outside the barn. Instead, Winona called him to the cabin for dinner, and they ate together at the rough-hewn table Jake had built with his own hands. Neither spoke much. The silence between them was different now, not hostile, but contemplative. Two people reassessing each other, adjusting the images they had constructed to accommodate new information. When the meal was finished, Winona looked at Jake with an expression that mixed curiosity with something that might have been vulnerability. "Tell me about your brother, the one who died." Jake had not spoken about Sam to anyone except Doc in years. The wound was too deep, too personal to share with strangers. But Winona was not exactly a stranger anymore. She was something else, something he did not have a name for. "His name was Sam. Samuel, really, but no one called him that except our mother, and she left when we were young." Jake's voice was quiet, roughened by memories he usually kept locked away. "He was 2 years older than me, but you'd never know it from the way he acted. Always optimistic, always believing that good things were just around the corner. He drove me crazy sometimes, but he was the only family I had left." "How did he die?" "Bandits. We were coming back from a mining claim with the first real money we'd ever made. They ambushed us on the road, shot Sam before he could even reach for his gun." Jake's hands tightened on the edge of the table. "Their leader was a man named Silas Crane. I've been looking for him ever since. For revenge, for justice, there's a difference." Winona considered this. "Is there, in my experience, revenge and justice wear the same face?" "Maybe, but revenge is about making yourself feel better. Justice is about making sure the person who hurt you can't hurt anyone else." Jake met her eyes. "Silas Crane is still out there somewhere, still killing, still taking. As long as he's alive, people like Sam will keep dying. That's what I want to stop. And when you find him, what then?" "Then I'll do what needs to be done." It was not a direct answer, but Winona seemed to understand what he meant. She nodded slowly, something like approval flickering across her features. "You are a man who carries heavy burdens," she said. "Loss, guilt, the weight of things you cannot change. I know something about that." It was the first time she had acknowledged any common ground between them. Jake felt something shift in his chest, that crumbling wall again, another section falling away. "Kohana told me about your mother, about what happened to her." Winona's face tightened, but she did not look away. "My mother was a good woman. Strong, kind, beloved by everyone in our village. She died protecting me from men who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to their greed. I'm sorry. Do not be sorry. Be angry. Anger is useful. It gives you strength when sorrow would make you weak." Her voice was fierce, but there was pain beneath the fierceness. "I have been angry for 13 years. It is the only thing that has kept me alive. Anger can keep you alive, but it can also kill you, just slower." She looked at him sharply, as if he had said something unexpected. "You sound like my father." "Your father is a wise man." "He is, wiser than I sometimes admit." Winona was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. "He believes you are different from other white men. He believes your honor is real, not a performance. I came here to prove him wrong." And now she did not answer immediately. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "Now I do not know what I believe. You confuse me, Jake Coulter. Every time I think I understand what you are, you do something that makes me question everything. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I do not know that either." She rose from the table, moving toward the door that separated the main room from the small sleeping area Jake had built. "But I am no longer certain that you are my enemy. That is, something." She disappeared into the other room, leaving Jake alone with the remnants of their meal and the echo of her words. It was something. It was more than he had dared to hope for. He cleaned the dishes in silence, listening to the small sounds of Winona preparing for sleep, and allowed himself to feel something he had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. The fourth week brought Silas Crane. Jake was in town when he first heard the name, standing in the general store and listening to two miners gossip about a gang that had been working the territory south of here. Robberies mostly, but some killings too. Anyone who resisted, anyone who might identify the perpetrators. They call the leader the Crow, one miner said, on account of how he always shows up after the violence is done, picking over the remains like a scavenger. I heard he's educated, talks like a gentleman, dresses like one too, but cold as a snake in January. Jake's blood turned to ice. Silas Crane. Here, in this territory. After years of searching, after countless dead ends and false leads, the man who had killed Sam was less than 100 miles away. Jake finished his business in town with mechanical efficiency, his mind racing through possibilities. He could ride south, try to find Crane's camp in, this once and for all. But that would mean leaving Winona alone, abandoning the responsibility Kohana had entrusted to him. He could wait, hope that Crane's activities brought him closer, be ready when the opportunity presented itself. But that was passive reactive, and Crane had proven himself too smart to walk into an obvious trap. He was still wrestling with these options when he returned to the ranch and found four riders waiting for him. They were arranged in a loose semicircle around the cabin, their horses stamping restlessly in the afternoon heat. Three of them were typical frontier hard cases, rough men with hard eyes and weapons worn with the casual confidence of regular use. But the fourth man was different. He sat his horse with the easy grace of someone who had been born to privilege, his clothing finer than anything Jake had seen outside of a city. His face was handsome in a cold, calculating way, marred only by a scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a memento of some past violence that had not quite finished the job. Silas Crane, the Crow himself. Jake's hand moved toward his pistol before he could stop it, 13 years of rage and grief coalescing into a single overwhelming impulse. But Crane's men were faster, their weapons were drawn, and pointed at Jake before his fingers touched the grip. Now, Crane's voice was smooth, cultured, exactly as the miners had described. Let's not be hasty. I'm here to talk, not to fight. I have nothing to say to you. You might when you hear what I have to offer. Crane smiled, a thin expression that did not reach his eyes. You see, I've been asking around about the people in this territory, learning who knows what, who's been where, and your name keeps coming up in connection with something very interesting. Jake said nothing, his mind racing. Where was Winona? Was she in the cabin? Had they heard her? As if reading his thoughts, Crane gestured toward one of his men, who dismounted and walked to the cabin door. He knocked once, then opened it without waiting for an answer. Empty. The cabin was empty. Relief flooded through Jake, followed immediately by concern. Where had she gone? Looking for someone. Crane's smile widened. Don't worry, we haven't touched your squaw. She rode off about an hour ago, heading west. My men thought about following her, but I decided she wasn't relevant to our business. What business? Crane leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes glittering with an intensity that made Jake's skin crawl. Gold, a motherlode somewhere on Apache land, supposedly found and abandoned years ago by a white man who was either too honest or too stupid to claim it. Jake's stomach dropped. I've heard rumors about that gold for years, Crane continued. Most people dismiss it as a legend, but I've learned to take legends seriously. They usually have a kernel of truth at their core. He fixed Jake with a penetrating stare. The rumors say the man who found it lives around here now. Built himself a little ranch, keeps to himself, has some kind of connection to the Apache that protects him from their usual hostility. I don't know anything about any gold. No, Crane's voice was soft, dangerous. That's strange because everything I've learned points to you. Jake Coulter, former prospector, former soldier, now rancher in the middle of nowhere. A man with no apparent source of income, but enough resources to build a comfortable homestead. I built this place with my own hands. Hard work, not gold. Perhaps, but you'll forgive me if I'm skeptical. Crane straightened in his saddle and his men's weapons remained steady on Jake. I'm going to make you an offer, Mr. Coulter, a generous one considering what I'm capable of. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. Tell me where the gold is and I'll let you live. I'll even give you a small percentage enough to relocate somewhere far from here. Start fresh. Forget any of this ever happened. And if I refuse, Crane's smile vanished, replaced by something cold and empty. Then I'll take what I need by other means. I understand you have a woman living here now, an Apache girl who might know things you're unwilling to share. I also understand you have a friend, an old doctor, who visits regularly. People you care about, people who could be persuaded. The threat was clear. Jake felt rage building in his chest, the same rage he had felt standing over Sam's body 13 years ago. His hand trembled with the effort of not reaching for his gun. You killed my brother. The words came out before Jake could stop them, ripped from somewhere deep inside by the pressure of years of grief and anger. Crane's expression flickered with surprise, then settled into something like amusement. Did I? I've killed a lot of men over the years. You'll have to be more specific. Nevada, 13 years ago, two brothers coming back from a mining claim. You shot the older one and left the younger for dead. Crane's eyes narrowed as he searched his memory. Sam, he said finally. Yes, I remember now. Hopeful fellow tried to negotiate. Had a younger brother who was faster with a gun than I expected, took out two of my men before we put him down. He looked at Jake with new interest. That was you, the younger brother. I thought you were dead. You thought wrong. Apparently so. Crane seemed genuinely delighted by this revelation. Well, this is an unexpected bonus. I came here looking for gold, and I found the one that got away. How fortunate. For me, maybe. Not for you. Crane laughed a genuine laugh, warm and rich, completely at odds with the monster who produced it. I like you, Jake. You have spirit. It would be a shame to kill you. He gathered his reins, preparing to leave. I'll give you 3 days to think about my offer. If I don't have the location of that gold by then, I'll start making your life very unpleasant, beginning with your Apache woman and your doctor friend. Touch them and I'll kill you. You're welcome to try and... Crane touched the brim of his hat in a mocking salute. 3 days, Mr. Coulter. Use them wisely. He and his men rode off, leaving Jake standing in the yard with murder in his heart and no way to act on it. 3 days. 3 days to figure out how to protect the people he cared about while dealing with the man who had destroyed his family. And somewhere out there, Winona was alone, not knowing the danger that had just ridden into their lives. Jake went into the cabin to get his rifle. Then he went to saddle his horse. He had work to do. Jake found Winona 3 miles west of the ranch, crouched beside a creek bed where wild herbs grew in the shade of cottonwood trees. Her hands were full of plants he did not recognize, and her expression when she saw him approach was one of wariness mixed with something that might have been relief. She had heard him coming long before he arrived. Of course she had. She was a warrior trained from childhood to read the land and everything that moved across it. But she had not run, had not hidden. She had waited for him, and Jake did not know what to make of that. He dismounted without speaking and led his horse to the water's edge. The animal drank gratefully, while Jake gathered his thoughts, trying to find words for a situation that defied easy explanation. You left the ranch. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Rode off without telling me where you were going. Winona's chin lifted, the familiar defiance flickering in her eyes. I am not your prisoner. I do not need permission to leave. No, you don't. But there are men looking for me, dangerous men, and they know about you. They'll use you to get to me if they can. Something shifted in her expression. Not fear, he doubted. Winona had felt true fear since she was 5 years old, but recognition. An understanding that the stakes had changed. What men? Jake told her everything. Silas Crane, the gold in the canyon, the threat against her, against Doc, against everyone Jake cared about. He did not soften the truth or hide the danger. She deserved to know exactly what they were facing. When he finished, Winona was silent for a long moment. Her hands had stopped moving among the herbs, and her eyes were fixed on some distant point beyond the creek, beyond the mountains, beyond anything Jake could see. This man killed your brother. It was not a question. Yes. And now he has come here seeking gold that you left behind 13 years ago. Yes. Because you chose honor over wealth, and that choice created consequences you could not foresee. Jake nodded, waiting for the accusation he knew must be coming. He had brought danger to her doorstep, had made her a target simply by existing in the same space as her. She had every right to be furious. But when Winona turned to face him, there was no fury in her eyes. There was something else, something that looked almost like understanding. My mother died because of gold. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but Jake could hear the old pain beneath the surface. The men who attacked our village were prospectors who believed we were hiding treasure. They tortured our elders, trying to make them reveal the location of riches that did not exist. When they realized there was nothing to find, they killed everyone they could reach out of spite. She stood brushing dirt from her hands with deliberate motions. Gold destroys everything it touches. You said that to my father and he believed you. Now I understand what buying. Winona, you did not bring this danger to me, Jake Coulter. The danger was already here waiting. Men like Silas Crane do not need reasons to hunt and kill. They do it because it is their nature. If it were not gold, it would be something else. Land, horses, simple cruelty. She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the flecks of lighter brown in her dark eyes. You are not responsible for the evil that other men do. You are only responsible for what you do in response. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He had spent 13 years carrying guilt for Sam's death, for the village he had watched burn, for every failure and weakness and moment of cowardice. To hear someone acknowledge that he was not the source of all the world's evil, that some things were beyond his control, was like having a weight lifted from his shoulders that he had not even known he was carrying. We need to go back to the ranch, he said. Prepare for whatever comes next. Winona nodded, but she did not move toward her horse. Instead, she stood looking at Jake with an expression he could not read. There is something you are not telling me. Her voice was soft but certain. Something that frightens you more than Silas Crane or his threats. Jake's heart stuttered in his chest. She was too perceptive, too attuned to the currents beneath the surface. He had hoped to have more time to find the right moment, but Winona was not going to let him hide. Yes, the word came out as barely more than a whisper. There's something I need to tell you. Something that might make you hate me even more than you did when you first arrived. I do not hate you anymore. She said it simply as if stating an obvious fact. I am not sure what I feel, but it is not hatred. Tell me your secret and let me decide what it means. Jake took a breath, then another. The words felt like broken glass in his throat, but he forced them out anyway. The day your mother died, the raid on your village, I was there. Winona went very still. Her face did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted, darkened, became dangerous. You were one of them. Her voice was flat, dead. You were one of the men who, no. Jake held up his hands, desperate to make her understand before she reached for the knife at her belt. I wasn't with them. I was riding through the territory 2 weeks before I found the gold in the canyon. I heard screaming saw smoke. I rode to the top of a hill to see what was happening. He forced himself to meet her eyes, to not look away from the horror dawning in them. I saw everything, Winona. I saw the raiders burning your village, killing your people. I saw a woman your mother die, trying to protect a child hidden in the rocks. And I did nothing. The silence that followed was the worst Jake had ever experienced. Winona stared at him with an expression that seemed to contain every emotion at once. Shock, betrayal, rage, grief, and something else that Jake could not identify. You were the man on the hill. Her voice was barely audible. The one with gray-blue eyes who watched and did nothing. Yes. I remembered you. All these years I remembered your face. I did not recognize you when I arrived because 13 years had changed you and because I did not want to believe. She trailed off, her hands curling into fists at her sides. I had one pistol with 6 shots, Jake said, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. There were at least 15 of them, armed and organized. If I had ridden down there, I would have died in the first 10 seconds, and it wouldn't have sued anyone. I made a calculation. A calculation. Winona's voice cracked like a whip. You calculated while my mother bled to death. You weighed the odds while they butchered my family. You sat on your horse and watched. I know. Jake did not try to defend himself. There was no defense. I know what I did, what I didn't do. I've lived with it every day since. Every night I see your mother's face in my dreams. Every morning I wake up knowing that I'm a coward who let innocent people die because I was afraid. Winona's hand moved toward her knife and Jake did not flinch. If she wanted to kill him, he would not stop her. He deserved whatever judgment she chose to render. But her hand stopped halfway to the weapon. Her whole body was trembling, tears streaming down her face in a way that seemed to shock her as much as it did Jake. She had probably not cried in years, had built walls around her grief so high and so thick that nothing could penetrate them. Those walls were crumbling now. "Why did you tell me?" The question came out as a sob. "Why did you not just keep your secret and let me believe you were a good man?" "Because I couldn't build anything real on a lie. Because you deserve the truth even if the truth destroys me." "Because," Jake's voice broke and he had to swallow hard before continuing. "Because I would rather you hate me for who I really am than love me for who I'm pretending to be." Winona stared at him through her tears, her expression shifting through emotions too complex to name. The knife was forgotten, her hand falling back to her side as something fundamental recalculated behind her eyes. "You are a coward." Her voice was raw, ragged. "You stood by while my mother died. You did nothing when you could have at least tried." "Yes. And then you spent 13 years carrying that shame, building a life based on honor because you knew you had failed to show any when it mattered most." "Yes. And now you tell me this, knowing I might kill you for it, because honesty matters more to you than survival." Jake did not answer. He simply stood there waiting for her verdict, accepting whatever came. Winona closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something had changed. The rage was still there, the grief of the betrayal. But there was something else now, too, something that looked almost like recognition. "You are a coward," she repeated. "But you are also the bravest man I have ever met." Only someone with true courage could confess to something so shameful knowing the cost. She took a step toward him, then another until she was close enough to touch. Her hand rose not to strike him, but to rest against his chest over his heart. "I do not forgive you. I may never forgive you. What you did, what you failed to do, that wound will never fully heal." Jake nodded, accepting her judgment. "But I understand." The words seemed to cost her something. "I understand the terror of facing impossible odds. I understand the shame of survival when others have died. I was 5 years old hiding in the rocks, watching my mother die, and I did nothing either. I was a child, I could do nothing, but the guilt does not care about logic. It eats at you regardless." Her hand pressed harder against his chest, as if trying to feel the beating of his heart. "We are the same Jake Coulter. Both of us broken by that day. Both of us carrying wounds that refuse to close. Perhaps that is why my father sent me here, not to judge you, but to recognize a kindred spirit." Jake covered her hand with his own, feeling the warmth of her skin, the slight tremor that ran through her fingers. "What happens now?" "Now we go back to the ranch. We prepare for the evil that is coming, and we see what kind of people we become when we face it together." She pulled her hand away and walked to her horse, mounting with the fluid grace that seemed as natural to her as breathing. Jake watched her for a moment, still processing what had just happened, still trying to believe that he had confessed his deepest shame and had not been destroyed by it. Then he mounted his own horse and followed her home. The next 2 days passed in a strange kind of limbo, preparing for a battle they knew was coming without knowing exactly when or how it would arrive. Jake fortified the ranch as best he could, reinforcing doors, positioning furniture to create cover, stockpiling ammunition in strategic locations. Winona worked alongside him without being asked, her knowledge of tactics and terrain proving invaluable. She had been raised as a warrior, trained from childhood in the arts of combat and survival, and her insights transformed Jake's defensive plans from adequate to formidable. They did not speak of his confession. The truth hung between them like smoke, impossible to ignore, but equally impossible to address directly. Winona's emotions were still raw, her feelings toward Jake a complicated tangle that she had not yet unraveled. She needed time to process what she had learned, and Jake was determined to give her that time. But there were moments, small, fleeting, when something passed between them that felt like the beginning of understanding. A glance held a second longer than necessary. A touch that lingered when passing tools or supplies. The way she positioned herself beside him rather than across from him, as if proximity had become more comfortable than distance. On the evening of the second day as they sat outside the cabin, watching the sun descend toward the mountains, Winona broke the silence. My father told you about the gold because he wanted to test you. He wanted to see what kind of man you would become when offered something that could transform your life. Jake nodded, not sure where she was going with this. But that was only part of his plan. The larger test, the one he has been orchestrating for 13 years, was this. She gestured between them at the space they shared, at the complicated bond that had formed despite every obstacle. He wanted to know if you could heal his daughter, and he wanted to know if his daughter could heal you. Can she? Winona was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than Jake had ever heard it. I do not know yet, but for the first time in 13 years, I think the answer might be yes. Before Jake could respond, the sound of hoofbeats reached them from the east. A single rider approaching fast, pushing his horse hard enough to raise a cloud of dust, visible even in the fading light. Jake's hand went to his pistol, but Winona shook her head. Apache, she said, her eyes fixed on the distant figure. I recognize the way he rides. As the rider drew closer, Jake could make out details, a young man mid-20s, with the fierce bearing of a warrior and an expression that mixed urgency with something darker. He was handsome in an intense way, his features sharp and proud, but there was a wildness in his eyes that put Jake on edge. Winona rose to her feet, her body tense. Chayton. The name meant nothing to Jake, but Winona's reaction told him this was someone significant. Her face had gone carefully blank, the mask she wore when she did not want her emotions to show. Chayton pulled his horse to a stop in a spray of gravel and dust, dismounting before the animal had fully settled. His eyes swept the ranch, taking in the fortifications, the positioning of Jake and Winona, the weapons within easy reach. Then his gaze fixed on Winona with an intensity that made Jake's hackles rise. He spoke rapidly in Apache, his words tumbling over each other in what sounded like a mixture of warning and accusation. Winona listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each sentence. When Chayton finished, Winona turned to Jake with a face that had gone pale beneath its bronze. He has done something terrible. Her voice was barely controlled. Something that may have destroyed us all. Jake looked at Chayton, who was now staring at him with open hostility. The young warrior's hand rested on the knife at his belt, his stance suggesting he would be happy for an excuse to use it. What did he do? Winona swallowed hard. Chayton has loved me since we were children. He believed that if he could prove you unworthy, prove that my father was wrong to trust a white man, I would return to our people, return to him. Jake felt the first stirrings of dread in his gut. How did he try to prove that? He went to the border towns, drank too much in a saloon where he should not have been, and when his tongue was loosened by whiskey, he spoke of things that should never be spoken. Winona's voice cracked. He told them about the gold. He told them that a white man knew where to find it. He told them about you, about me, about everything. The dread crystallized into cold certainty. Jake understood now, understood exactly what had happened and what it meant. Silas Crane. The name came out flat dead. Chayton gave Silas Crane everything he needed to find us. Winona nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Chayton did not know who he was speaking to, did not understand that his words would reach the ears of a monster. He only wanted... She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. Chayton spoke again, his voice defensive, angry. Jake did not need to understand the language to recognize someone making excuses, trying to justify the unjustifiable. He says he did not mean for this to happen. Winona translated, her voice bitter. He says he only wanted to expose you as a fraud. He says... She stopped, visibly fighting for control. He says he is sorry. Jake looked at the young warrior, really looked at him past the hostility and the fear. Chayton was young, probably no more than 25, driven by emotions he did not fully understand and making decisions that seemed reasonable in the moment, but carried consequences far beyond his comprehension. Jake had been that young once, had made similarly foolish choices driven by similar feelings. The main difference was that Jake's mistakes had only gotten his own brother killed, not endangered an entire community. When did this happen? Jake asked, keeping his voice level with effort. How long ago did he talk to Crane's people? Winona relayed the question. Chayton's answer made her face go even paler. 3 days ago, the same day Crane came to your ranch, which meant Crane had already known everything when he confronted Jake. The offer to share information had been theater, a way to gauge Jake's reactions to confirm what Chayton had already revealed. The 3-day deadline was not a negotiation. It was a countdown to an attack that had been planned from the beginning. "They're coming." Jake spoke the words with certainty. "Probably tonight, definitely by tomorrow. Crane won't wait any longer now that he knows we're on to him." Winona translated for Chayton, who seemed to shrink under the weight of what his actions had set in motion. The arrogance had drained from his posture, replaced by something that looked like genuine horror. He spoke again, his voice smaller now, almost pleading. "He says he came to warn us." Winona's translation was toneless. "He says he will fight beside us to make amends for what he has done." Jake considered this. Having another warrior on their side would be valuable. Chayton was clearly trained, probably skilled and motivated now by guilt, if nothing else. But trusting someone who had already betrayed them once was a risk. He looked at Winona. "What do you think?" The question seemed to surprise her. She had not expected Jake to defer to her judgment, especially on something this important. "Chayton is a fool." Her voice was hard, unforgiving. "But he is not evil. He acted from jealousy and wounded pride, not malice. And he is a skilled warrior, one of the best among our people." "Do you trust him?" Winona hesitated. Her eyes moved to Chayton, who was watching the exchange with anxious intensity. Something passed between them, a history Jake was not privy to, years of shared experiences and complicated feelings. "I trust that he wants to make this right." Her voice softened slightly. "Whether that is enough, I do not know. But we need every advantage we can get." Jake nodded. He turned to Chayton and spoke directly to him, knowing Winona would translate. "You made a mistake. A bad one. People might deed because of what you did." Chayton's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. "I'm not going to pretend that's okay, because it's not. But I also know something about making mistakes you can't take back. About living with guilt that eats at you every day." He held Chayton's gaze, seeing in the young man's eyes a reflection of his own past failures. "You want to make amends, then fight beside us. Protect the people you endangered with your carelessness. And if we survive this, spend the rest of your life being the kind of man who thinks before he acts." Winona translated, and Chayton listened with an intensity that suggested he was hearing more than just words. When she finished, he nodded once sharply and spoke a single word that needed no translation. "A warrior's oath, a commitment that would hold until death or dishonor." "Good." Jake turned to survey the ranch, his mind already calculating angles of attack, fields of fire, defensive positions. "We have work to do and not much time to do it. Winona, show Chayton where we've positioned everything. I need to ride to Doc's place, warn him about what's coming, get him somewhere safe." Winona caught his arm as he moved toward his horse. "Jake, be careful." The words were simple, but the emotion behind them was not. Jake covered her hand with his own, allowing himself one moment of connection before the storm hit. "I will. Keep each other alive until I get back." He rode hard through the gathering darkness, pushing his horse as fast as the terrain would allow. Doc's cabin was an hour away under normal circumstances. Jake made it in 40 minutes, arriving with a horse that was lathered with sweat and a heart that was pounding with more than just exertion. The cabin was dark when he arrived. No smoke from the chimney, no lamp in the window. Jake felt the first stirring of panic as he dismounted and approached the door. "Doc." He knocked once, twice. "Doc, it's Jake. Open up." Silence. The kind of silence that felt wrong, heavy with implications Jake did not want to consider. He tried the door. It swung open at his touch, unlocked, revealing an interior that was illuminated only by the moonlight streaming through the windows. Doc was sitting in his chair by the cold fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and a folded piece of paper on his lap. He looked up as Jake entered, and his expression was one of grim resignation. "I wondered when you'd come." Doc's voice was tired, older than Jake had ever heard it. "I got a visitor earlier today. Unpleasant fellow with a scar and a fancy way of talking." Jake's blood went cold. Crane was here. "Came to deliver a message," he said. "Wanted me to know that he had friends in every corner of this territory and that running would be pointless." Doc took a sip of whiskey. "He also wanted me to know that if you don't give him what he wants, I'll be the first one he kills." The paper on Doc's lap was the message Jake realized. Written proof of Crane's threats designed to ensure compliance through fear. We need to get you out of here. Jake moved toward the old man, reaching for his arm. Somewhere safe, somewhere Crane can't. Doc held up his hand, stopping Jake mid-stride. I'm not running. His voice was quiet but firm. I've spent 65 years on this earth, Jake. Seen things that would break most men, done things I'm not proud of, and somehow managed to keep breathing through all of it. I'm not going to spend my last years hiding from some jumped-up bandit with delusions of grandeur. Doc, this isn't a game. Crane will kill you. Maybe, probably even. Doc set down his whiskey and rose from the chair with the slow, careful movements of a man whose body had stopped cooperating with his intentions years ago. But I'll tell you something I've learned in all my years of patching up the broken and the dying. The measure of a man isn't how he dies, it's what he leaves behind when he goes. He moved to a cabinet against the wall and opened it, revealing a small arsenal of weapons Jake had not known existed. Pistols, rifles, ammunition enough for a small war. I was a surgeon in the Union Army, Jake. Spent 4 years cutting men apart and putting them back together, learning exactly how fragile human beings are and exactly how much punishment they can take. He selected a rifle, checked its action with practiced ease. I also learned how to shoot. Never thought I'd need that skill again, but here we are. Jake stared at his friend, seeing him with new eyes. The tired old doctor, the whiskey-soaked philosopher, the gentle healer, all of those were real. But beneath them was something else, something forged in the same crucible that had shaped Jake himself. A survivor, a fighter, a man who had looked death in the face and refused to flinch. You're coming back to the ranch with me. Jake's voice left no room for argument. If we're going to face Crane, we do it together. Doc smiled, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I was hoping you'd say that. Been a long time since I had a good fight. Might be nice to go out with my boots on instead of in some sickbed. They loaded Doc's weapons onto Jake's horse. The old man's own mount was not fit for hard riding, and doubled up for the journey back to the ranch. The moon was high by the time they arrived, casting silver light over a landscape that looked peaceful, but felt anything but. Winona and Chayton had been busy in Jake's absence. New fortifications had appeared around the cabin barricades constructed from hay bales and furniture. Chayton had positioned himself on the roof of the barn, giving him a clear line of sight to the main approach. Winona waited by the cabin door, bow in hand, her face showing relief when she saw Jake return. The relief shifted to confusion, then recognition as she spotted Doc behind him. The old healer. Her voice was neutral, careful. You have brought him into our fight. He brought himself. Jake helped Doc down from the horse. Crane threatened him. He refuses to run. Doc extended his hand toward Winona with the same easy courtesy he had shown during his first visit. Ma'am, I understand we're going to be fighting alongside each other. I want you to know I may be old, but I can still hit what I aim at. Winona studied him for a moment, assessing. Then she took his hand, her grip firm. Any enemy of Silas Crane is a friend of mine. Welcome to our war. They spent the remaining hours of darkness preparing. Jake briefed everyone on Crane's likely tactics, drawing on memories of the ambush that had killed Sam and knowledge gained from years of studying the outlaw's methods. Crane was cunning, patient, and utterly ruthless. He would not attack until he was certain of victory, and he would not hesitate to use any advantage, no matter how underhanded. Doc shared his own insights, his experience as an army surgeon, giving him a unique perspective on how men behaved under fire. Chayton offered what he remembered from his drunken conversation, details that might help predict Crane's approach. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they had a plan. Not a good plan necessarily. They were still badly outnumbered, still defending a position that was never designed for warfare, but a plan nonetheless. Something to hold on to when the chaos started. Jake stood at the window of the cabin, watching the sun rise over the mountains. Winona appeared beside him, her presence a warmth he had grown accustomed to over the past weeks. Are you afraid? Her voice was soft, private. Jake considered the question honestly. No, not of dying anyway. I've been ready for that for a long time. He paused, searching for the right words. I'm afraid of failing the people who are counting on me. Afraid of watching someone else I care about die while I survive. Winona reached out and took his hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a few weeks ago, that now felt as natural as breathing. Then we will not fail. Her voice carried the certainty of someone who had decided something important. And we will not let each other die. Whatever comes, we face it together. Jake squeezed her hand, drawing strength from the contact. Whatever they had become to each other, allies, friends, something more, it was real. Built not on lies or pretense, but on shared pain and hard-won trust. Outside, a hawk circled overhead, and its cry cutting through the morning stillness. The day had begun, bringing with it whatever fate had in store. They were as ready as they would ever be. And somewhere out there, riding toward them with death in his heart and greed in his soul, Silas Crane was coming to collect his debt. The attack came at noon when the sun was highest, and the defenders' eyes were most likely to be dazzled by the light. 12 riders emerged from the tree line to the south, spreading out into a skirmish formation that spoke of military training or hard-won experience. Crane had positioned himself at the center of the group, easy to identify by his black clothing and the arrogant way he sat his horse. Jake watched from the cabin window, counting enemies, calculating odds. 12 against 4, terrible numbers, but not impossible. They had the advantage of fortifications, of knowing the terrain of desperation. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was not. Crane raised his hand, and the rider stopped just outside rifle range. His voice carried across the distance, clear and mocking. "Jake Coulter, I gave you 3 days. Your time is up." Jake did not respond. He knew better than to engage in verbal sparring with a man like Crane. Every word was a potential weakness, a crack that could be exploited. "I know you're in there," Crane continued. "You and your Apache woman and whoever else you've gathered for this last stand. I'm offering you one final chance. Come out, tell me where the gold is, and I'll let the others live. Wow, and I'll burn that cabin to the ground with everyone inside." Silence from the defenders. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying dust and tension. Crane's smile faded. "Very well. You have made your choice." He dropped his hand and the attack began. The first wave came from the south, 4 riders charging directly at the cabin while the others provided covering fire. Jake had anticipated this. It was the obvious opening move designed to pin down the defenders, while secondary attacks probed for weaknesses. Chayton's rifle cracked from the barn roof, and the lead rider tumbled from his saddle. A second shot from Doc dropped another. The charge faltered, the surviving riders wheeling their horses away from the unexpected resistance. Flanking. Winona's warning came from the west side of the cabin. Jake spun to see 3 men on foot working their way through the cover of the outbuildings toward the cabin's blind spot. He brought up his rifle and fired, catching one man in the chest. Winona's arrow took a second through the throat. The third dove behind a water trough, pinned down, but not eliminated. The battle dissolved into chaos. Smoke filled the air, the crack of gunfire mixing with shouts and screams. Jake lost track of time, lost track of everything except the rhythm of shoot, reload, shoot that had been drilled into him during the war. Crane's men were good professional, disciplined, willing to take casualties if it meant gaining ground. They pushed forward relentlessly, using numbers and firepower to slowly overwhelm the defenders' positions. Doc went down first. A bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him away from the window where he had been firing. Jake saw him fall and then felt something cold grip his heart. "Doc, I'm alive." The old man's voice was strained but steady. "Keep fighting. I've had worse." Chayton abandoned the barn roof when it became untenable, sliding down and sprinting for the cabin through a hail of bullets. He made it inside with blood streaming from a gash across his ribs, another wound that was bad but not fatal. 4 defenders against 8 remaining attackers. The odds had improved, but they were still behind. Then Crane played his final card. A torch arced through the air, trailing smoke and flame, and landed on the cabin roof. The dry wood caught immediately fire, spreading with terrifying speed across the shingles Jake had laid with his own hands. "Out or burn," Crane's voice rose above the chaos. "Your choice, Coulter." Jake looked at his companions. Doc bleeding on the floor, Chayton grimacing through his pain, Winona with her bow drawn and her eyes blazing with defiance. They had fought well, better than anyone could have expected, but the end was coming. The fire would drive them into the open where Crane's superior numbers would finish the job, unless Jake gave himself up. The thought crystallized with terrible clarity. If he surrendered, if he offered himself in the location of the gold in exchange for the others' lives, there was a chance Crane would accept. The outlaw was a businessman at heart, more interested in profit than in unnecessary killing. It was suicide. Jake knew that. Crane would never let him live once he had what he wanted, but it might save the others. Jake, Winona's voice cut through his calculations. She was looking at him with an expression that said she knew exactly what he was thinking. No. If I go out there, if you go out there, you die for nothing. Crane will kill us anyway once he has what he wants. Your sacrifice would be meaningless. She's right. Doc's voice was weak but firm. Don't be a martyr, Jake. Fight smart. The fire was spreading smoke beginning to fill the cabin. They had minutes at most before the structure became uninhabitable. Jake's mind raced through options, discarding each one as impossible or suicidal. They could not stay. They could not surrender. They could not fight their way out through 8 armed men. Then he heard a sound that cut through the chaos like a knife through silk. A war cry. Apache. They came from the west, emerging from the tree line like ghosts given flesh. 20 warriors led by a figure Jake recognized even at this distance. Kohana. The Apache chief had been watching just as he had said he would, waiting to see what Jake would do, how he would face the test. And now, when all seemed lost, he had brought salvation. Crane's men wheeled to face this new threat, their disciplined formation dissolving into confusion. Some tried to fight raising weapons against the oncoming wave. Others broke and ran, self-preservation overwhelming any loyalty to their leader. The battle became a rout. Apache arrows and bullets tore through Crane's remaining forces, cutting them down with ruthless efficiency. Within minutes, only Crane himself remained surrounded by enemies, his empire of violence collapsing around him. Jake emerged from the burning cabin, his rifle raised, his eyes fixed on the man who had murdered his brother. Crane had dismounted or been pulled from his horse and was backing toward a rock outcropping, his pistol sweeping back and forth between the warriors who surrounded him. His face had lost its composure, the mask of civilized cruelty giving way to something more primal. Fear. Coulter. The name came out as a snarl. This isn't over. Kill me, and there are 100 more who'll come for that gold. 1,000. You'll never be. Jake raised his rifle and fired. The bullet took Crane through the chest, exactly where his own bullet had struck Sam 13 years ago. The outlaw staggered, his expression shifting from rage to something that looked almost like surprise. Then he fell, and Silas Crane, the crow, the killer, the monster, was finally irrevocably dead. Jake stood over the body, breathing hard, waiting for the satisfaction he had expected to feel. The closure. The sense that justice had finally been served. It did not come. There was only emptiness and a bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to go beyond physical fatigue. Winona appeared at his side, her hand finding his. She did not speak, there was nothing to say. She simply stood with him, bearing witness to the end of something that had defined Jake's existence for more than a decade. Kohana approached through the smoke and chaos, his warriors parting to let him pass. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held something that might have been approval. You fought well. Yeah, the chief's voice was measured, thoughtful. All of you. Better than I had any right to expect. Jake met his gaze. You were watching the whole time. Of course, I've been watching for 13 years. This was simply the final test, the moment when you would prove whether my faith in you was justified. And Kohana looked at Jake, at Winona, at the burning cabin, and the bodies scattered across the ground. You chose to protect others instead of saving yourself. You fought beside my daughter instead of using her as a bargaining chip. You faced your enemy with courage even when all seemed lost. He placed his hand on Jake's shoulder, the weight of it carrying a significance that went beyond the physical. You are worthy, Jake Coulter. The debt between us is paid. From this day forward, you are not just an ally of my people, you are family. Jake felt something break loose in him, some wall he had built so long ago that he had forgotten it was there. Tears he had not shed in years burned at the corners of his eyes. He looked at Winona, found her looking back at him with an expression that combined exhaustion, relief, and something else. Something that looked like the beginning of love. The cabin was still burning behind them. Doc was wounded, Chayton was bleeding. The ranch Jake had built with his own hands was rapidly becoming ashes. But somehow, impossibly, Jake felt like he had finally come home. The fire consumed everything Jake had built. He stood watching the cabin collapse in on itself, sending a spiral of sparks toward the night sky, like souls ascending to whatever waited beyond. The heat was intense, even from 50 feet away, warming his face while his back remained cold in the autumn air. Winona stood beside him, her hand in his, and together they witnessed the destruction of the life he had constructed over 8 years of solitary labor. Every board he had cut and fitted, every nail he had driven, every hour of backbreaking work transforming raw wilderness into something that resembled a home. All of it was gone now, reduced to ash and ember in memory. Jake expected to feel grief, loss, the hollow ache of watching something precious disappear. Instead, he felt something closer to relief, as if the fire was not destroying his past but liberating him from it. The cabin had been a fortress, a place to hide from the world and the pain it had inflicted. Now that fortress was gone, and Jake would have to build something new. Something better, perhaps. Something that was not designed to keep people out. Kohana's warriors had made camp in the meadow east of the burning structure, their fires creating a constellation of smaller lights that mirrored the inferno consuming the cabin. The Apache chief himself stood apart from his men, speaking quietly with Chayton near the tree line. Jake could not hear their words, but the young warrior's posture suggested he was receiving a lecture he would not soon forget. Doc was the immediate concern. The old man had been moved to a makeshift shelter constructed from salvaged canvas and branches, where one of Kohana's warriors, a healer whose skills apparently matched his fighting ability, was tending to the gunshot wound in his shoulder. The bullet had passed through cleanly missing bone and major vessels, but Doc had lost a significant amount of blood during the battle, and his age made recovery uncertain. Jake left Winona watching the fire and walked to where his friend lay, wanting to see for himself that the old man was still breathing. The Apache healer looked up as Jake approached, his expression neutral, but not unwelcoming. "He is strong for his years." The healer's English was accented but clear. "The wound is clean. If fever does not take him, he will live." Jake knelt beside Doc, taking in the pallor of his skin, the shallow rhythm of his breathing. The old man's eyes were closed, but as Jake settled onto the ground beside him, they fluttered open. "Still here." Doc's voice was a whisper barely audible above the crackle of the distant fire. "Told you I'd go out with my boots on." "You're not going anywhere. The healer says you'll make it." A ghost of a smile crossed Doc's weathered face. "The healer is being optimistic. I can feel it, Jake, the way my body's fighting itself. 65 years is a long time. Eventually the machine just stops working." "Don't talk like that." "I'll talk however I damn well please. One of the privileges of being old and shot." Doc's eyes found Jake's, and despite the pain and exhaustion in them, they held a familiar clarity. "Listen to me. I don't have energy for long speeches, so I'm only going to say this once." Jake leaned closer, his throat tight. "You did good today. Not just the fighting anyone can fight when their back's against the wall. I mean the choices you made, the way you protected people instead of running, the way you faced Crane without letting hate consume you." Doc's hand found Jake's arm, his grip weak but insistent. "That's who you really are, Jake. Not the coward you have been punishing yourself for being. Not the failure you have convinced yourself you are. You're a good man who made hard choices in impossible situations, and it's time you started believing that." Jake's vision blurred. He blinked hard, unwilling to let the tears fall while Doc was watching. "You taught me that. Everything I know about being decent, about being human, I learned from watching you." "Bullshit. I just pointed out what was already there." Doc's grip tightened momentarily, then relaxed. "Now, there's something else. That woman of yours, Winona. She's special. Don't let fear keep you from building something real with her. Don't make the same mistake I did waiting too long, convincing yourself you don't deserve happiness. Doc, promise me." The old man's eyes were fierce despite his weakness. "Promise me you'll stop hiding. Stop protecting yourself from love because you're afraid of losing it. Life is loss, that's the fundamental truth of existence. But it's also connection and joy and moments of grace that make all the suffering worthwhile. Don't miss those moments because you're too busy preparing for the pain." Jake could not speak. He simply nodded, the gesture carrying the weight of an oath. Doc seemed satisfied, his eyes closed and his breathing steadied into the rhythm of deep sleep. The Apache healer moved in to check his patient, and Jake stepped back, giving the man room to work. He walked away from the shelter, away from the burning cabin, away from everything that demanded his attention. He needed a moment alone, a moment to process the emotional hurricane that had torn through him over the past few hours. The battle, Crane's death, Doc's words, the way Winona had looked at him when the fighting ended like he was something precious that she had almost lost. He found a spot on a low rise overlooking the valley, the grass cool beneath him, as he sat and stared up at the stars. The sky was vast and indifferent, filled with the same lights that had witnessed every human triumph and tragedy since the beginning of time. Jake felt small beneath them, small and finite, and ultimately insignificant in the cosmic scheme of things, but also strangely at peace. Footsteps approached from behind. Jake did not turn. He recognized Kohana's tread by now, the particular rhythm of a man who had spent decades moving through landscapes where every sound could mean life or death. The chief settled onto the grass beside him, moving with a fluid grace that belied his 63 years. For a long moment, neither man spoke. They simply sat together, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. "You fought well today." Kohana's voice was quiet, contemplative. "Better than I expected. Better than most men twice your experience. I had help. Yes, but help means nothing if the man receiving it does not know how to use it. You knew, you positioned your people well adapted to changing circumstances, kept fighting when lesser men would have broken." Kohana paused. "You have the soul of a warrior, Jake Coulter. I saw it 13 years ago, and I see it now." Jake turned to look at the chief, studying the weathered features illuminated by starlight. "Why did you come? You could have let Crane kill us. Let the problem solve itself." "I could have. It would have been the safer choice. Let the white men destroy each other, keep my people uninvolved." Kohana's expression was unreadable. "But safety is not always wisdom. And there were other considerations. Your daughter. Partly, Winona is precious to me, and I would not let her die if I could prevent it." The chief turned to face Jake directly. "But that is not the whole truth. There is something else, something I have kept from both of you, waiting for the right moment to reveal it." Jake felt a shift in the air, a tension that suggested whatever was coming would change things fundamentally. He braced himself, not knowing what to expect. "You told Winona about the day her mother died." It was not a question. "You confessed that you were the man on the hill, watching, doing nothing." "Yes." That confession was brave, necessary, but incomplete. Kohana's eyes held Jake's with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "You believed you were telling her a secret, something no one else knew, but you were wrong." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Jake was only beginning to understand. "I saw you that day, Jake. Saw you sitting on your horse at the top of the ridge, watching my village burn. I was one of the warriors who arrived too late to save anyone. We had been hunting 2 days' ride from home, and by the time we returned, the raiders were gone and our people were dead." Jake's mouth went dry. "You knew. All this time, you knew I was there." "I knew. I saw your face, your expression, the way your hands gripped your reins, as if you wanted to charge down and help, but could not make yourself move. I saw you turn and ride away when it was over your shoulders, bent under a weight that was already crushing you." "Then why?" Jake could not finish the question. His mind was reeling, struggling to reconcile this revelation with everything he thought he understood about his relationship with Kohana. "Why did I let you live 13 years ago in the canyon? Why did I send my daughter to you, knowing you had watched her mother die?" Kohana's voice softened slightly. "Because I understood something about you that you did not understand about yourself." He shifted, turning to face the valley below, where the last embers of Jake's cabin were fading into darkness. "I have lived 63 years, Jake. I have seen every kind of man. This world produces the brave and the cowardly, the cruel and the kind, the ones who act without thinking, and the ones who think without acting. You are none of those things. You are something rarer." "What?" "A man who carries his failures like stones around his neck, using them to build character instead of walls. A man who looks at his own weaknesses and chooses to become better rather than making excuses." Kohana's voice carried the weight of long observation. "The day I found you in the canyon, you could have lied about the gold, could have taken what you wanted and tried to escape. Instead, you told the truth and accepted whatever consequences came. That is not the action of a coward. That is the action of a man who has been broken by cowardice and rebuilt himself into something stronger." Jake was silent, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. "I sent Winona to you because I knew something she did not, that you were the only person alive who truly understood her pain. You had witnessed the same trauma from the other side. You carried the same guilt, the same impossible questions about what you could have done differently. I believed that if anyone could help her heal, it was you. And I believed that in helping her, you might finally heal yourself. You used us. The words came out without accusation, simply stating a fact. Manipulated us into the situation without telling us the truth. Yes, Kohana did not flinch from the charge. I manipulated you both. I kept secrets that were not mine to keep. I played with your lives like pieces on a game board. He paused. And I would do it again without hesitation because the result has been exactly what I hoped for. How can you know that? How can you know we've healed? Kohana smiled, and for the first time since Jake had known him, the expression seemed genuinely warm. Because I watched you confess your deepest shame to my daughter, knowing it might destroy everything between you. Because I watched her choose forgiveness over hatred, connection over isolation. Because I watched you fight side by side today, protecting each other, with your lives moving together like two parts of the same whole. He rose to his feet, his movements smooth despite the hour and his age. The wounds are not fully healed. Perhaps they never will be. But you have both stopped bleeding, Jake. You have both started to live again instead of simply surviving. That is worth any manipulation, any secret, any deception. And Jake looked up at the chief, this man who had shaped his life in ways he was only now beginning to comprehend. What happens now? Now you rebuild. Not just the cabin, though that too if you wish, but everything, your life, your relationships, your sense of who you are and who you can become. Kohana extended his hand, offering to help Jake to his feet. And you do it knowing that you have family now. Not just Winona, but my people as well. You proved yourself today, and that proof will not be forgotten. Jake took the offered hand and rose, feeling the strength in Kohana's grip, the connection between them that went beyond words. Thank you. It was inadequate, but it was all Jake could manage. Do not thank me yet. Winona can be challenging. You will have many opportunities to regret accepting her into your life. But Kohana's eyes were warm, and Jake understood that the warning was also a blessing. Come. The night grows cold, and there is much to discuss before dawn. They walked back toward the camp, together, two men who had started as strangers and become something closer to father and son. Behind them, the last embers of the cabin fire died away, leaving only ash and the promise of new beginnings. The days that followed the battle blurred together in a haze of exhaustion, grief, and the hard work of recovery. Doc survived the first night and the second and the third. The Apache healer's skills proved formidable, and the old man's stubbornness provided an additional defense against death that no medicine could replicate. By the end of the first week, he was sitting up and complaining about the quality of the food, a sure sign that his cantankerous spirit remained intact. But the wound had taken its toll. Doc could no longer grip a surgical instrument with his damaged shoulder, could no longer ride for long distances without pain that left him gray-faced and trembling. The life he had built, traveling from homestead to homestead, healing the sick and wounded across hundreds of miles of territory, was over. He was 65 years old, crippled by a bullet that had been meant for someone else, and facing a future that looked nothing like the one he had imagined. Jake expected bitterness, rage at the unfairness of it, at the way a single moment of violence could erase decades of capability. Instead, Doc displayed an acceptance that bordered on serenity. I've had a good run. The old man was sitting in a chair that Kohana's warriors had constructed for him, watching Jake and Chayton clear debris from where the cabin had stood. More years than most people get doing work that mattered to people who needed it. Can't ask for much more than that. You're not dead yet. Don't write yourself off. I'm not writing myself off. I'm being realistic. Doc shifted in his chair, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing wound. I can't do what I used to do. That's just a fact. The question is what I do instead. Jake paused in his work, leaning on his shovel. What are you thinking? Well, there's this valley. Nice piece of land, good water, decent grazing. Seems like the kind of place a man could settle down, maybe teach some of what he knows to younger folks who might want to learn. Doc's eyes found Jake's, and there was a hint of the old mischief in them. I hear the owner might be looking for help rebuilding. Room and board in exchange for whatever useful skills an old cripple can offer. Jake felt something loosen in his chest. He had been dreading this conversation, assuming Doc would want to leave to find somewhere he could spend his remaining years in comfort. The idea of his friend staying of building something together had not occurred to him. You'd do that live out here in the middle of nowhere with a former hermit and his Apache wife. Former hermit, Doc chuckled. I like that. Acknowledges change while respecting history. He grew more serious. Jake, I don't have family. Never did after Elizabeth died. You and Winona are the closest thing I've got to people who give a damn whether I live or die. Where else would I want to spend whatever time I have left? Jake walked over to his friend, abandoning the shovel, and extended his hand. Doc took it, his grip weaker than it had been, but still firm. Then welcome home, Doc, such as it is. Such as it will be, Doc corrected him. We've got work to do. The rebuilding began in earnest after that. Kohana sent warriors to help with the heavy labor young men who approached the task with the same discipline they brought to everything else. Trees were felled and stripped logs notched and fitted walls raised with a speed that would have been impossible for Jake alone. Winona worked alongside the men, refusing to be relegated to traditional women's tasks, despite the raised eyebrows of some of the older warriors. She had been raised as a fighter trained in skills that crossed gender boundaries, and she was not about to abandon that identity just because she now had a home to tend. Jake watched her swing an axe with practiced efficiency, her form perfect, her strength surprising for someone of her build. She caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. Something amusing. Just admiring the view. She snorted, but there was a hint of pleasure in her expression that she could not quite hide. Their relationship had shifted since his confession, since the battle, since everything that had happened in the past weeks. The walls between them were gone, replaced by something more complicated and more beautiful. A partnership built on honesty, mutual respect, and a growing tenderness that neither of them had expected. They had not yet spoken the words, had not formally declared what they were becoming to each other. But the declaration was there in every gesture, every glance, every moment they spent simply existing in the same space. Kohana departed after 2 weeks, taking most of his warriors with him, but leaving Chayton behind. The young man had been assigned to serve as a liaison between Jake's homestead and the Apache people, a role that was partly punishment for his betrayal and partly an opportunity for redemption. Chayton threw himself into the work with a fervor that bordered on obsession, as if he could erase his guilt through sheer physical effort. He spoke little, kept his head down, and accepted every difficult task without complaint. Jake watched his progress with the eye of someone who understood exactly what the young man was going through. He reminds me of myself, Jake told Winona one evening as they sat watching the sunset from the foundation of their new home. After Sam died, I worked like that too, trying to outrun the guilt, trying to exhaust myself, so I wouldn't have to think. Did it work? No, but it kept me alive until I found something better. He took her hand, interlacing their fingers. One better. Winona leaned against his shoulder, her warmth a comfort against the cooling air. He will find his way. Chayton is young and foolish, but he has a good heart underneath the pride. My father would not have chosen him as his successor otherwise. Successor. Did he not tell you Chayton is to lead our people when my father's time comes? It is why he pushed so hard, why he was so desperate to prove himself. He believed that if he could not win me, he could not be the leader our people needed. Jake absorbed this information, adjusting his understanding of the young warrior who had nearly gotten them all killed. The pressure of expected leadership, the fear of inadequacy, the desperate need to prove worth, these were things Jake understood intimately. Maybe I should talk to him, share some of what I've learned about carrying impossible expectations. Maybe? Winona lifted her head to look at him. But not tonight. Tonight is for us. She kissed him, then soft and slow, and Jake let the rest of the world fade away. The new cabin took shape over the following months, larger than the original, with room for Doc and space for guests. Kohana sent craftsmen to help with the finer details, intricate carvings around the doorframe, a stone fireplace that would hold heat through the coldest nights, windows placed to catch the morning light. Doc established a small clinic in one corner of the main room, training Winona and Jake in basic medical techniques that would serve the scattered homesteads of the region. Word spread that the gruff old doctor was still available if no longer mobile, and soon people began making the journey to Jake's Valley seeking help that could not be found elsewhere. The Henderson family came first, Martha bringing her children to thank Jake for saving their lives. She insisted on contributing to the rebuilding effort, organizing the other homesteaders' wives into a network of support that transformed Jake's solitary existence into something resembling a community. "You've changed," Martha told him during one of her visits. "The man who rode into our yard that day, he was hard, closed off, like he was already dead inside and just hadn't stopped breathing yet." She smiled. "This man, the one standing in front of me now, he's alive. Really alive. It's good to see." Jake did not know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded and accepted the compliment with as much grace as he could manage. The seasons turned. Summer faded into autumn. Them surrendered to a winter that was harsh, but survivable in the new cabin with its efficient fireplace and well-insulated walls. Spring arrived with thawing snow and the first hints of green pushing through the brown earth. And with spring came the news that changed everything. Winona told him on a morning in early April, when the world was balanced between winter's retreat and summer's advance. She had been quiet for several days, distracted in a way that Jake initially attributed to memories of her mother whose death had occurred around this time of year. He found her standing by the creek behind the cabin, watching the water rush past with an expression he could not read. "What's wrong?" She did not answer immediately. When she turned to face him, her eyes held something he had never seen there before, a vulnerability that went beyond anything their shared traumas had revealed. "I'm going to tell you something." Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling slightly. "And I need you to let me finish before you respond." Jake nodded, fear and hope warring in his chest. "When I came here, I expected to hate you, expected to prove my father wrong about everything he believed. Instead, I've found something I never anticipated: a man worth respecting, worth trusting." She paused, her throat working. "Worth loving." Jake stepped toward her, but she held up her hand, stopping him. "Let me finish. What we have built together, this home, this life, it is more than I ever thought possible. More than I believed I deserved after so many years of hatred and isolation. You have given me a reason to look forward instead of backward, and I do not have word adequate to express what that means." She took a breath, and when she continued, her voice was softer. "But now there is something else. Something that will change everything again, whether we want it to or not." Her hand moved to rest on her stomach, a gesture so small and so significant that Jake's heart seemed to stop beating entirely. "I am carrying your child." The words hung in the morning air like something sacred, something that demanded reverence and awe. Jake stared at Winona, at the hand on her stomach, at the fear and hope mingled in her eyes. A child. Their child. A new life created from the connection they had built, the wounds they had healed, the love they had found in the wreckage of their pasts. "Jake," her voice was uncertain now, vulnerable, in a way he had never heard before. "Say something." He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and took her face in his hands, looking into her eyes with everything he felt laid bare. "I love you." The words came out rough, inadequate, but true. "I have loved you since the day you told me I was the bravest man you'd ever met, even though I was also a coward. I have loved you through every argument, in every silence, in every moment we've spent learning who we really are." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the corners of her mouth. "And I will love this child, our child, with everything I have. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what we've created together. I will make mistakes, and I will fail sometimes, but I will never stop trying. Never stop fighting for this family." Winona's tears mingled with his as she pulled him close, her arms wrapping around him with a strength that belied her trembling. "I was afraid." Her voice was muffled against his chest. "Afraid you would see this as a burden, an obligation, another responsibility you never asked for. I asked for it the moment I chose to stop hiding, the moment I let you in." He held her tighter. "This isn't a burden, Winona. This is the best thing that has ever happened to me." And they stood by the creek as the morning light strengthened around them. Two people who had found each other across a gulf of pain and loss, now facing a future neither had dared to imagine. When they finally walked back to the cabin, Jake's arm around Winona's shoulders, Doc was waiting on the porch with a knowing smile. "Figured it out, did you?" The old man's voice was gruff, but his eyes were warm. "I noticed the signs weeks ago. You two are about as subtle as a thunderstorm." "You knew?" Jake stared at his friend. "And you didn't say anything?" "Not my place. Besides, watching you figure it out was more entertaining than anything that's happened around here in months." Doc pushed himself to his feet, moving with care for his still healing shoulder. Congratulations, both of you. You're going to be terrible parents probably, but you'll figure it out. Everyone does. Winona surprised them both by crossing to Doc and embracing him, a gesture of affection that would have been unthinkable from the woman who had arrived here filled with hatred and distrust. Thank you, she whispered, for helping him become the man I love. Doc patted her back awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional display, but unwilling to push her away. He did the hard work himself. I just kept him alive long enough to do it. Kohana arrived 3 days later, summoned by some messenger Jake had not seen depart. The chief listened to the news with an expression that shifted from surprise to satisfaction to something that looked very much like joy. A grandchild. He spoke the words like they were sacred. I had hoped, but I did not dare to expect. The spirits have blessed you both. They sat together around the fireplace that evening, Jake, Winona, Kohana, Doc, and Chayton, who had earned his place at the table through months of dedicated service. The fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cabin that represented so much more than wood and stone. Have you chosen a name? Kohana asked. Winona looked at Jake, and something passed between them, a conversation without words, a decision made in the space of a heartbeat. If it is a boy, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion, we will call him Samuel, after my brother. The room went quiet. Doc's hand moved to cover his eyes, and even Chayton, who had not known Sam, seemed to understand the significance of the moment. Samuel. Kohana tasted the name, rolling it around in his mouth like fine wine. A strong name, a name that carries history and hope. He would have liked that, Doc said quietly. Sam always wanted his name to mean something, to be remembered for more than just dying young. He will be remembered, Jake's voice was firm, through his nephew and through the stories we tell. Sam Coulter was a good man who deserved better than what he got. His name will live on. Kohana nodded solemnly. And if the child is a girl, Winona answered, this time her hand finding Jake's, Mika, after my mother. Another silence deeper than the first. Kohana's eyes glistened in the firelight, and for a moment the mask of the chief slipped away, revealing the grieving husband who still mourned his lost love. Mika, his voice was barely a whisper. She would be honored. She would be so proud of the woman you have become, a daughter. The conversation drifted after that, touching on lighter topics, plans for expanding the cabin, preparations for the coming baby, the community that was slowly growing in the valley Jake had once claimed as a refuge from the world. But underneath the practical discussions ran a current of something larger, something that connected all of them in ways that transcended blood or culture. Family. Not the family any of them had been born into, but the family they had chosen, the family they had built from the ruins of their separate tragedies. Later, after the others had retired, Jake and Winona stood on the porch of their home, looking up at the star-filled sky. Her hand rested on her stomach where new life was growing, and his arm was around her shoulders, pulling her close against the chill of the night air. Are you happy? The question came out before Jake could stop it, a vulnerability he would once have guarded jealously. Winona considered it seriously, as she considered everything. I did not know what happiness was before. I thought it was the absence of pain, the filling of empty spaces with things that did not hurt. But now I understand that happiness is something else entirely. It is connection, purpose, the knowledge that your life has meaning beyond mere survival. She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. Yes, I am happy. Happier than I ever believed possible. Jake kissed her soft and slow, pouring into the gesture everything he felt but could not say. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard and the stars seemed brighter than before. We should go inside, Winona murmured. It is cold. Amun. In a minute. Jake pulled her closer, unwilling to surrender this moment to practical concerns. I want to remember this. All of it. The stars, the cold, the way you look right now. I want to carry this with me for the rest of my life. Winona smiled, a real smile, warm and unguarded, the kind he had once believed he would never see from her. You are a sentimental fool, Jake Coulter. Maybe, but I'm your sentimental fool. Yes, she leaned her head against his shoulder. You are. They stood together in the darkness, two people who had found redemption in each other's arms, looking toward a future that promised both challenges and joys. Behind them, the cabin glowed with warmth and light. Before them, the valley stretched out under the endless sky, waiting to see what they would build next. 13 years ago, Jake had walked away from gold because taking it felt wrong. Tonight, holding the woman he loved while their child grew inside her, he understood at last what he had gained in exchange. Everything that mattered. Everything that was real. The measure of a man was not what he took from the world, it was what he left behind when he was gone. Jake intended to leave behind a legacy of love, of courage, of honor, earned through hard choices and harder lessons. And standing under those ancient, indifferent stars, he finally believed that he might succeed.